In the autumn of 2002, the United States was still recovering from the trauma of September 11th. Airports were under tight security. People looked over their shoulders in public places, and the idea of safety, even in the suburbs, felt more like an illusion than a guarantee. But no one, not even the most paranoid, expected what was about to unfold in the heart of the country's capital region. This is the true story of how two men, one a highly trained former soldier, the other a vulnerable teenage boy, terrorized an entire population from inside the trunk of a car. Their weapon, a high-powered rifle. Their targets, completely random. Their motive, more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. What began as an isolated shooting quickly turned into one of the most intense manhunts in American history. A case that paralyzed cities, changed law enforcement strategies, and exposed the terrifying vulnerability of everyday life. It started without warning. James Martin was a 55-year-old program analyst, father, and beloved member of his local church. That afternoon, like so many others before it, he stopped by a local grocery store in Wheaton after work. As he walked across the parking lot with his shopping bags in hand, he suddenly dropped to the ground. A woman nearby saw him collapse. She thought he may have had a heart attack, but when she rushed to help, she saw something worse. Blood pooling around him. James had been shot. She ducked behind a nearby car and dialed 911. Emergency services arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. James Martin died in the ambulance from a single bullet wound to the chest. There were no witnesses who saw a gun, no sounds of a fight, no suspicious individuals. Just one quiet gunshot, and then silence. At first, police treated it as an isolated homicide, perhaps a mugging gone wrong, but something didn't add up. James wasn't robbed. His wallet and personal items were untouched, and the autopsy revealed something alarming. The bullet that killed him had been fired from a high-powered rifle, one capable of long-range precision. It was an unsettling detail, but the horror had only just begun. The next morning, Montgomery County woke up to news of the previous night's murder. The local media covered it briefly, but no one could have predicted what was coming next. At 7:41 a.m., Sonny Buchanan, a 39-year-old landscaper, was mowing the lawn at the Fitzgerald Auto Mall in Rockville. He was known in the area, friendly, hard-working, always punctual. As he pushed his mower in neat rows, a shot rang out. He dropped to the ground instantly. Customers and employees rushed out to find him unresponsive. He had been shot in the chest. Less than 30 minutes later, just 5 miles away, another shooting occurred. Prem Kumar Walekar, a 54-year-old taxi driver originally from India, was filling up his car at a mobile gas station in Aspen Hill. He was shot once in the torso and died on the scene. He had 3 daughters and had worked in the D.C. area for over a decade. At 8:37 a.m., Sarah Ramos, a 34-year-old housekeeper, was sitting on a bench outside a post office, waiting for her employer. She had a Spanish-language book open on her lap when a single bullet entered her head. She died instantly. 10 minutes later, Laurie Ann Lewis Rivera, a 25-year-old nanny and mother of a 3-year-old daughter, was vacuuming her minivan at a Shell gas station. Witnesses heard the gunshot but saw no shooter. She was pronounced dead at the scene. At 9:58 a.m., the 5th victim of the morning, 72-year-old Pascal Charlot, was shot while walking down Georgia Avenue. He had been on his way to buy groceries for his wife. A single bullet ended his life in an instant. 5 people, killed in public, broad daylight, all in the span of less than 2 hours, all within a 10-mile radius. The city was in shock. By noon, the streets of Montgomery County were empty. Schools went into lockdown. Outdoor activities were canceled. People avoided gas stations and grocery store parking lots. Police advised residents to shelter in place. Even walking across the street became a source of anxiety. Families started driving erratically to avoid becoming targets. It wasn't uncommon to see pedestrians running in zigzag patterns or crouching behind cars. The randomness of the shootings meant that no one felt safe, and everyone could be next. The killer, it seemed, had no pattern. The victims were male and female, young and old, of different ethnicities and backgrounds. There was no known connection between them. The only common factor was the method: a single bullet, perfectly placed from a distance. Law enforcement set up dozens of checkpoints. SWAT teams monitored rooftops, school zones, and wooded areas. Officers inspected every white van they came across, largely due to a witness who had reported seeing one at the scene of Sarah Ramos's murder. It was a tip that would later prove misleading, but at the time, it was the best lead they had. Theories began to circulate. Some believed the sniper was a trained assassin. Others speculated it was an act of terrorism, still fresh in the national psyche just a year after 9/11. Was it Al-Qaeda, a domestic extremist, a lone gunman with military training? The media didn't help. Television anchors ran sensational headlines. Radio hosts theorized live on air. Fear turned into obsession. At the Montgomery County Police Department, Chief Charles Moose led the press briefings. Calm but visibly tense, he addressed the public multiple times per day, urging citizens to remain alert and to report any suspicious behavior. Behind the scenes, the FBI and ATF analyzed ballistics. Their early findings confirmed that all the bullets came from the same type of rifle, a Bushmaster XM15E2S, chambered in .223 caliber. It was a civilian version of the M16, lightweight, accurate, and deadly. But even more concerning was the trajectory of the bullets. All shots had been fired from near ground level, traveling in straight lines. This ruled out a rooftop shooter. The sniper wasn't above the crowd. He was among them, likely in a car. This realization changed everything. A new hypothesis emerged. The shooter was firing from inside a vehicle, possibly from the trunk, using a custom-built concealment. It explained the clean escapes, the lack of sightings, and the speed with which the killer vanished after each attack. The idea was chilling. The killer could be anyone, in any car, sitting at a stoplight, parked near a playground. There was no pattern, no rhythm, and no warning. The police urged residents not just to avoid open spaces, but to look around constantly, even while pumping gas. People were told to crouch while filling their tanks, to move quickly from their homes to their vehicles, and to cover their heads when walking across parking lots. As the sniper continued his rampage, the map of attacks began to spread outward. What had started in Montgomery County now threatened a much wider area. Every new shooting widened the radius of fear. No place felt safe. At 2:30 p.m. in the parking lot of a Michael's craft store in Fredericksburg, Virginia, a 43-year-old woman named Caroline Sewell was loading bags into her minivan. She had just finished grocery shopping. Without warning, a single gunshot struck her in the abdomen. Caroline collapsed, but unlike the previous victims, she didn't die. A bystander called 911 immediately, and paramedics managed to stabilize her. She was rushed into surgery and survived. Doctors later revealed that the bullet had pierced her liver, a potentially fatal injury, but rapid response saved her life. Caroline became the sniper's first known survivor. Ballistics confirmed it was the same rifle, the Bushmaster XM15. A witness at the scene said they saw a white van fleeing the area. Once again, this led police to believe they were hunting someone in a commercial vehicle. The now infamous white van theory took over headlines. Three days later, the sniper did something even more disturbing. At 8:09 a.m., outside Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie, Maryland, 13-year-old Iran Brown was dropped off by his aunt, Tanya. As he walked toward the school entrance, a gunshot rang out. Iran collapsed, bleeding from his chest and stomach. Tanya, a nurse and former Navy medic, reacted instantly. She sprinted to her nephew, carried him back to the car, and raced to the nearest hospital. Along the way, she kept pressure on the wound and kept Iran conscious. Surgeons worked for hours. Iran had a shattered diaphragm and damage to his liver, stomach, and pancreas. But he survived. For the first time, the sniper had targeted a child. The psychological impact on the public was enormous. Parents began pulling their kids from school. Bus routes were canceled. Outdoor recess was suspended across multiple counties. Authorities searched a nearby wooded area for evidence, and what they found sent chills down their spines. Pinned to a tree near the sniper's apparent firing position was a tarot card, the death card. On the back of the card was a handwritten message. "For you, Mr. Policeman, call me God. Don't tell the press." It was the first direct message from the killer, cold, taunting, and deeply calculated. The public panic now reached a boiling point. National news covered the shootings 24/7. The term DC sniper became a household phrase. Police departments across Virginia, Maryland, and DC were overwhelmed with tips. More than 100,000 calls flooded the tip lines, many from people claiming to have seen something or someone or somewhere they thought seemed suspicious. The vast majority of these leads turned out to be false. The idea of the white van became an obsession. Any commercial vehicle, FedEx, plumbing companies, moving trucks, was pulled over and searched. Officers reported people calling 911 just because a van was parked near a shopping center. Meanwhile, Chief Charles Moose continued holding public press conferences. He looked tired, frustrated, desperate. Some questioned whether releasing too much information to the public was backfiring. The killer, after all, was likely watching the news, and he seemed to be adapting. Each new revelation released by the police was followed by a change in the killer's tactics, suggesting that whoever was behind this was not only skilled, but also strategic. After 3 quiet days, the sniper struck again, twice in a single day. The first shooting occurred in Manassas, Virginia, outside a gas station. The victim, Dean Harold Myers, was a civil engineer and Vietnam veteran. He was shot while refueling his car. Later that night, 53-year-old Kenneth Bridges was shot and killed at an Exxon station near Fredericksburg. He was a businessman and father of 6, on his way to a conference. Again, no witnesses. Again, no fingerprints. Just one shot and gone. This time, the FBI took over communications and strategy. A mobile command center was set up. Behavioral analysts worked around the clock to create a profile. They believed the killer was likely male, military trained, and operating with a partner. Someone to drive, while the other fired. The clean execution of the crimes made it clear this was no amateur. Five days passed without an attack. Then, on the evening of October 14th, outside a Home Depot in Falls Church, Virginia, 47-year-old Linda Franklin was helping her husband load a shelf into their car. A gunshot. She dropped. Her husband never even saw the shooter. Linda was an FBI analyst. Her death devastated the law enforcement community. She had worked closely with agents who were now investigating her own murder. Witnesses again claimed to see a white van, but one man gave a detailed report. He said the shooter was an Arab-looking man who fled in a white vehicle. Police issued a bolo. Be on the lookout for white vans, trucks, even ice cream trucks. Dozens were pulled over. Hundreds were searched. None of them were connected to the case. It was later discovered that the man who gave the Arab shooter description hadn't even been at the scene at the time of the shooting. Security footage placed him leaving the parking lot 3 minutes after Linda was killed. He had made the entire story up. Why? No one knows. He was later charged with obstruction of justice. But the damage had been done. That false lead wasted countless man-hours and almost cost investigators the real suspects. A few days later, emergency dispatch in Montgomery County received a chilling call. The voice was male. Calm, clear. Don't speak. Just listen. We are the ones doing the shootings in your area, and here's how you know it's us. We left a tarot card that says, "Call me God." We've tried to contact you 3 times. You haven't responded. People have died because of your failure. He then mentioned a previously unreported shooting, one that occurred inside a liquor store in Montgomery County weeks earlier, involving a revolver. In that case, a woman had been shot and killed. The detail had never been released publicly. That was the proof. The caller was real. The killer, or at least one of them, had just made contact. The FBI now knew 2 things. 1, the sniper wanted to negotiate. 2, the killer was following the media coverage closely. The stakes were rising fast. The sniper had spoken, but he didn't just want attention, he wanted a deal. A letter arrived shortly after the call, placed in a Ziploc bag and left in a wooded area near the scene of the most recent attack. Inside was a typed message, cold, structured, and threatening. It began with the same signature phrase, "Call me God." Then came the demand. You will deposit $10 million into a Bank of America account. This account must allow unlimited withdrawals from any ATM in the world. You have until 9 a.m. Monday to complete the transaction. If you attempt to apprehend us during withdrawal, prepare more body bags. And at the bottom, a postscript more chilling than any threat. Your children are not safe, anywhere, anytime. Inside the bag was also a DNA sample. The FBI ran it through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, but no match was found. Still, it was something. The killer had left behind his first forensic trace. The authorities were now engaged in psychological warfare. The sniper had proven he could strike anyone, anywhere. And now he was trying to control the investigation. The demand for money, paired with a threat to children, pushed the fear into new territory. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit weighed in. The sniper wanted power, control, recognition. He was watching the media closely and reacting to police strategies. And now, with a deadline for payment, the team was on the clock. Law enforcement responded strategically. Rather than publicly deny the demands, they played along, buying time. Analysts dissected the language of the letters. Linguists examined word choice, grammar, and phrasing. Even the type of paper and ink were analyzed. Meanwhile, the manhunt intensified. Mobile units were dispatched across 3 states. Surveillance helicopters patrolled suburban zones. Undercover agents posed as civilians in parking lots and shopping centers. But then came a breakthrough from a totally unrelated case. The shooter had mentioned a liquor store killing that had occurred weeks earlier. A woman had been shot inside the store, execution style, with a revolver. Police had ruled it a robbery. At that crime scene, the assailant had accidentally dropped a firearm magazine, the kind used for loading bullets into rifles. At the time, it had seemed like a small clue. But now, with the sniper claiming responsibility, the FBI re-examined it. Forensic analysts dusted the magazine for prints, and they found one. The print matched a young man already in immigration records, Lee Boyd Malvo, a 17-year-old Jamaican national who had recently entered the United States. But Malvo wasn't just a suspect. He was a connection. In Malvo's immigration paperwork, one name came up again and again, John Allen Muhammad, the same man who had been mentioned weeks earlier in a dismissed tip, a Gulf War veteran with extensive weapons training, known to own a Bushmaster rifle. Everything was starting to align. The FBI reopened the call logs and found the original tip about Muhammad. It had come from Robert Holmes, a former Army colleague. Holmes had warned that Muhammad was unstable, obsessed with his ex-wife and children, and owned a rifle matching the sniper's weapon. He also said Muhammad had spoken about going to Washington. At the time, the call was one of more than 100,000 tips and had been overlooked. Now, it was gold. Agents contacted Holmes again and asked him to listen to the recordings of the sniper's calls to 911. Without hesitation, he confirmed, "That's John. That's his voice." Within hours, the FBI had pieced together a basic profile. John Allen Muhammad, 41 years old, veteran of the Gulf War, trained as a marksman, recently divorced, had lost custody of his 3 children, known to be radicalized after September 11th, close relationship with a teenage boy, Lee Boyd Malvo. Now they needed to find them. Investigators began digging deeper into their backgrounds, and what they found was unsettling. Muhammad had changed his name from John Williams after converting to Islam. His life had spiraled after losing custody of his children. Friends reported he had become isolated, bitter, and increasingly paranoid. He had served honorably in the military, but left with deep psychological wounds. He had been living in shelters and moving state to state. Malvo, meanwhile, was a teenager with a tragic past. Born in Jamaica, he had been abandoned by his father and abused by his mother. He met Muhammad in Antigua, where the two formed a bond. To Malvo, Muhammad became a father figure. To Muhammad, Malvo was the perfect disciple. They lived together in homeless shelters, in cheap motels, and sometimes inside their car, a dark blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice. The car was key. Reports began surfacing that witnesses had spotted a blue sedan, not a white van, near multiple crime scenes. At the time, the white van narrative had been so dominant that these details had been dismissed. Now, they fit perfectly. The FBI issued a nationwide BOLO for Muhammad, Malvo, and the blue Chevrolet Caprice. On October 22nd, the sniper struck one last time. Conrad Johnson, a 35-year-old bus driver, was shot and killed as he climbed into his vehicle to begin his morning route. It was 6 a.m. The fatal bullet came from the same Bushmaster rifle. That evening, investigators made a critical decision. They would release the suspects' names, photos, and vehicle information to the public. 6 hours later, at 1 a.m. on October the 24th, a man resting at a rest stop off I-70 in Maryland recognized the blue Chevrolet Caprice parked near his truck. He called 911. Police quietly surrounded the vehicle. Inside, Muhammad and Malvo were asleep. There was no struggle. SWAT officers opened the doors, pulled both men out, and placed them under arrest. The nightmare was over. When investigators searched the Caprice, they were stunned. The back seat had been modified to allow access to the trunk. A hole had been drilled near the license plate. From inside the trunk, the shooter could lie prone, slide the rifle barrel through the hole, and fire without being seen. It was a mobile sniper's nest, concealed, stable, and deadly. The Bushmaster XM-15 was inside, along with scope, ammunition, and more handwritten notes. DNA found in the Ziploc bag matched both Muhammad and Malvo. They had left behind everything investigators needed, but only after weeks of fear, panic, and bloodshed. The terror had ended. But the story was far from over. With John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo in custody, the focus now shifted from the streets to the courtroom. The trial would reveal a disturbing portrait of manipulation, indoctrination, and a mission far more twisted than anyone had imagined. Almost immediately, Malvo began talking. At first, he confessed to all the murders, claiming full responsibility. He said Muhammad had nothing to do with it, that he had acted alone. But investigators didn't buy it. The forensic evidence told a different story. Both men's DNA had been found on the rifle. Both had written parts of the letters, and both had traveled together across states where attacks had occurred. The level of coordination, the vehicle modifications, the planning. It was too complex for a teenager alone. Under pressure and with legal counsel, Malvo changed his story. He admitted Muhammad had trained him, that he had taught him to shoot, to kill, to hide, that Muhammad had selected the victims. Malvo described being brainwashed, molded, and instructed to obey without question. To the prosecution, he was a killer. To the defense, he was a child soldier in a domestic war orchestrated by a broken man. John Allen Muhammad was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder and acts of terrorism. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. In court, he remained mostly silent. He declined to testify, showed no emotion, and rarely looked at the jury. His defense team argued he was mentally unfit, that his military service had left him with untreated PTSD and delusional thinking. But the evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics, fingerprints, letters, and witness statements painted a clear picture. In March 2004, Muhammad was found guilty and sentenced to death. Lee Boyd Malvo was tried separately. At just 17 years old during the attacks, he was ineligible for capital punishment under federal law. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During his trial, more of the truth emerged. Malvo revealed what Muhammad had truly been planning. The chaos, the killings, the letters, they were a smokescreen. Muhammad's real goal was to use the sniper attacks as a distraction. He wanted to terrorize the DC region long enough for police to lose control, and in that chaos, kidnap his 3 children from his ex-wife and flee the country. But it didn't stop there. According to Malvo, Muhammad had a broader vision: to raise and train an army of children, 70 boys and 70 girls, in Canada. He wanted to teach them guerrilla warfare, indoctrinate them with extremist ideology, and one day return to the US to launch a revolution. A new society, one that he believed would end racial injustice, a warped version of justice through mass violence. It sounded delusional, like something out of a dystopian novel, but it had been real enough to claim 16 lives. For the families of the victims, justice took time. On November 10, 2009 at 9:11 p.m., John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. He declined to make a final statement. Witnesses said he showed no emotion as he died. Lee Boyd Malvo remains in prison, serving multiple life sentences. In recent years, he has expressed remorse, giving interviews in which he describes his regret, his psychological state, and his admiration for Muhammad, which he says has long since turned to shame. His case has reopened debates about juvenile sentencing, brainwashing, and culpability. Some advocate for re-evaluation of his sentence. Others argue that his crimes were too severe to justify anything less than life behind bars. The DC sniper case changed the way Americans thought about random violence. It reshaped how police departments respond to active threats, how the FBI coordinates with local law enforcement, and how forensic science is used under pressure. It also left scars. For weeks, millions of people lived in fear, afraid to walk across parking lots, pump gas, or send their children to school. The randomness of the attacks made them uniquely terrifying. There was no pattern, no warning, no logic, just the silent threat that at any moment, from any direction, death could come. In the end, what caught the killers wasn't high-tech surveillance or a shootout. It was a fingerprint on a dropped magazine, a trace of humanity in the middle of terror. It reminds us that evil, no matter how calculated, leaves a mark. The story of the DC snipers isn't just about murder. It's about manipulation, about how fear can paralyze a nation, about how a man's obsession can destroy innocent lives, and how a boy, abandoned and exploited, can be turned into a weapon. It's a story of pain, of justice, and of the price of silence. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, truth eventually comes to light. These are the 6 most ingenious scams ever pulled off in casinos. In general, trying to cheat in a casino is not a good idea. You should accept that the odds are always against you unless you're playing poker and you're better than everyone else. However, some people just can't stand the idea of the casino always having the upper hand, so they figure out ways to beat them at their own game. Sometimes, the scams are frankly ridiculous, but others seem straight out of a James Bond movie. The stories you'll hear here are as bizarre as they are unbelievable. But I won't lie to you, these aren't tricks you can use to become a millionaire. If you get caught, you'll likely not only get kicked out, but also be fined for fraud. That's how sure they are that you're going to lose. When someone goes on a winning streak, they check all the cameras and investigate thoroughly to figure out what's going on. They know you shouldn't be winning, so something must be off. And let's not even talk about slot machines. Those things are ticking time bombs, already calculated with their jackpots in mind. In fact, and this is kind of funny, they can kick you out of any casino if they see you're winning too much against the odds. Even if they don't find anything suspicious after reviewing the cameras, scanning the whole place, or interrogating everyone. If you're winning more than you should, they can simply ban you, and in some cases, even refuse to pay out your winnings. And we'll see examples of that in this video. With that policy in place, learning about these stories is at least fun. It feels like a form of poetic justice. To organize this list, we'll start with the simpler scams and work our way up to the most ingenious. And when we get to number 1, you'll probably laugh out loud. But let's start. In 2012, the simplest plan was devised to win at a casino. Stealing, but not stealing by cheating, just plain theft. The method was this. A group of about 5 people would approach a roulette table. While some distracted the croupier, the ones pretending to play would steal a few chips, only the lower value ones. Once they had them, they'd leave the table and hand the chips off to another accomplice. That person, somehow, it's not exactly explained, managed to sell those chips at a higher value. In short, they were stealing low-value chips, artificially inflating their value, and cashing them out. With this simple method, in quotation marks, the group, more than 50 people in total, managed to scam several casinos. However, since it was a method easily identified on camera, they eventually got caught. Still, a few years on the run while scamming casinos isn't bad. Reportedly, they made about $2,000 a night, but it's unknown how much they made in total. Even now, new groups keep trying similar tactics. Many were arrested, but they can't stop new bands from forming and doing the same thing. 60 seconds. That's all it took to steal $1 million. Sounds like a movie, but that's exactly what happened. Also, in 2012, while the others were stealing chips for a couple thousand, these guys were making millions. How? By exploiting a flaw in Citibank ATMs, specifically the ones placed inside certain casinos. It appears the flaw only existed in those specific machines. The issue was that for 60 seconds, you could withdraw unlimited funds from your account, essentially more money than you actually had. Knowing that, a group of 14 people followed a simple plan. First, each opened a Citibank account and deposited a minimum amount of money. Then, one by one, they would go to the ATMs and withdraw as much cash as they could in those 60 seconds, always keeping each transaction under $10,000. Since they were in the casino, they had to blend in, spend a little at the tables before leaving so as not to raise suspicion. It wasn't like someone just showed up, withdrew loads of cash, and left. That would have looked weird. As you can see, the plan was easy, but so was tracing them. It was just a matter of time before Citibank noticed $1 million had vanished. You can't lose that kind of money from your ATMs without someone asking questions. Apparently, they hadn't really thought that part through. As a result, it didn't take long before they were all caught. Now we get into weirder, more elaborate territory. So much so that I can barely imagine how they pulled it off. The story begins with Monique Laurent, who in 1973 came up with a way to cheat at roulette that would later be dubbed the cigarette pack scam. The concept was relatively simple. Monique, along with some family members, sat at the roulette table. With the croupier in on the plan, they swapped out the ball for a modified version. This special ball could later be controlled via a tiny remote hidden inside a cigarette pack. Once the swap was made, her family just had to bet, guiding the ball roughly to where they wanted it to land. Although the remote wasn't perfectly precise, it didn't need to be. Just narrowing down a range was enough to make safe bets, ones that won 80% of the time. The casino had cameras everywhere and thoroughly questioned the croupier, but they couldn't figure out what was happening. It was an invisible scam. However, Monique and her family overlooked one thing. If the same girl is always present when a table starts losing money and she's always holding the same cigarette pack, a pattern starts to form. They watched her closely, and every time she showed up, the roulette table lost money. They followed her and eventually searched the famous cigarette pack, finding the remote control inside. Their own brilliance blinded them. Had they stopped earlier, they could have made a fortune, maybe $500,000. But greed made them push their luck, not realizing they were drawing attention. In 2011, a group attempted to scam the game of Baccarat. To summarize, Baccarat is somewhat like blackjack, but you don't need to know the rules to understand what they did. If you're familiar with games like blackjack, you'll know how important it is that the card order remains random, and how powerful it would be to even roughly know the order. That's exactly what a Chinese group known as the Cutters did in Las Vegas. They got their nickname because when you ask the dealer to cut the deck, they let you. In many casinos, it's even customary for the player to do the cut themselves, meant to assure players that the cards aren't being manipulated. Taking advantage of this, the group devised a plan. One of them wore a hidden camera up their sleeve. During the cut, they recorded the card order. A second person received the footage, and their accomplices used the information to place bets. It was a simple technique, but perfected over years. They started in Asia and eventually took the scam worldwide. What's most interesting is that no one has been caught. Authorities know of a few people, but the network is so vast and organized that casinos can only hope they don't show up. They're believed to have made tens of millions with this system, simply because they've been doing it for so long. Just 4 people, a Frenchman and 3 Italians, managed to win over $80,000 playing poker, but not regular poker. They were playing against the dealer. See, regular poker isn't like typical casino games, where the house always wins in the long run. When playing against other players, it all depends on your skill. And as we've seen, many people make a living playing poker, usually online, where you get more hands per hour. But in this case, the group didn't win $80,000 by being lucky. They could literally see the cards. Here's how it worked. All 4 sat at the same table. Every time the Frenchman got his cards, he would mark them with invisible ink. The others, wearing special contact lenses, could clearly see the marks and enjoy easy wins. In just 2 sessions, they made those $80,000, but that was enough to raise suspicions. Remember, casinos don't believe in luck, and they don't like it when players win. It means something's wrong. After checking everything, they discovered the cards were marked. A line for aces, a cross for kings. It doesn't sound like much, but it was more than enough to gain an advantage. It took them a while to figure it out. After all, who would suspect an elaborate strategy involving invisible ink and specialized lenses? All that was missing was a drunken James Bond sipping a martini. And boom, we've got a movie. For number 1, we go back to Baccarat, like blackjack, but more luck-based, and our protagonist is Phil Ivey. Most people probably know who he is, but I'll introduce him anyway. Phil Ivey is a professional poker player who has won millions in both live and online tournaments. He's one of the most recognizable faces in the poker world, alongside Daniel Negreanu, Phil Hellmuth, and of course, the legendary Annette Obrestad. It's surprising to see a pro poker player in a video about scams and cheating, but this story is unique. In July 2012, Phil Ivey was at the Borgata Casino in New Jersey. Now, it might seem crazy for someone as statistically aware as him to play a game where the house always wins, like Baccarat. But this time, he sat down and just started winning, again and again. Luck was fully on his side. Of the 3 times he visited the casino that year, he won every time. Because he bet big, he ended up with nearly $10 million in winnings. Since he was a high roller, the casino agreed to several of his requests. Playing in a private room with a companion, having a Chinese-speaking dealer, using a specific brand of cards that were automatically shuffled. Now, here's why that mattered. It turned out that the specific brand of cards had subtle inconsistencies on the back. If you paid close attention, you could spot small differences in the patterns. He didn't spot them, his companion did. She would tell Phil roughly what each card was, and since the dealer didn't speak their language, he didn't catch on. Some might argue the casino should have seen this coming after all. Those very specific requests were a red flag, but in Baccarat, superstitions are common, and casinos often accommodate unusual demands to keep players happy. They would have dressed a tiger up as the dealer if it meant the player kept betting big. In the end, the casino refused to pay the $10 million. They argued that it wasn't cheating, but it was advanced strategy. But no matter what you call it, if your strategy causes the casino to lose, they'll call it fraud. As I said at the beginning of the video, when you walk into a casino, you should expect to lose. That's honestly the best thing that can happen. Because if you win, you're bound to come back for more, and we all know how that story ends. And that's it, family. Subscribe, give it a like if you enjoyed it. Big hug, and see you soon. Here are 3 mysteries that still haven't been solved. The world is a beautiful place, isn't it? Well, not always. Let's darken the tone a bit. Number 3. The Boy Scout Camp. It was just the 2nd day of camp. 22 Boy Scouts and 9 adults were there to supervise them. They had just started their trip. It happened during the early hours of April the 26th, 1970. They had set up camp in the open air, forming a circle around a campfire to fight off the cold. Some slept in their sleeping bags outside, while those who were colder stayed in the tents. The 9 supervisors spread out to cover as much territory as possible. The night was calm. Everyone slept peacefully, until the first light of morning began waking them around 7:30 a.m. That's when they realized not everyone had made it through the night so peacefully. As they walked through the camp, they found Terrence Bowers, still in his sleeping bag, surrounded by a pool of his own blood. When the police and medical examiner arrived, they saw he had been stabbed in the chest, the back, and several times in the arm. The wounds on his arm were likely the first ones. He had tried to defend himself. The coroner concluded that the wounds were extremely recent. At the latest, they had been inflicted between 6 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. That's just about an hour before everyone else had woken up. What was most bizarre, though, was that even though the sleeping bags and tents were all just a few meters apart, no one heard a thing. And sure, that might be a clue in itself. But no matter how you think about it, it still seems strange, especially to me, since I'm a light sleeper. Of course, everyone is different. Some people sleep so soundly you could blow a horn next to them and they wouldn't wake up. Others, like me, wake up at the sound of a fly in another room. But 21 kids and 9 adults? Statistically, at least someone should have woken up. Unless they did and pretended to stay asleep out of fear. Everything felt off. They searched the area. They never found the knife. There were no suspects, no witnesses, and no motive. Terrence wasn't hated. He was just an 11-year-old kid on a trip. Eventually, a man, Robert Weekly, who had previously been in the Scouts, confessed to the murder, claiming it was revenge for having been expelled because of Terrence. Apparently, he had previously been accused of abusing some of the kids. Of course, the police interrogated him, but he failed to provide the key details that only the real killer would know. Most obviously, he couldn't say where the weapon was. It's very important to confirm those things. As crazy as it may sound, there are people who will falsely confess to crimes they didn't commit. Sometimes for attention, sometimes to protect someone, sometimes because they genuinely want to go to prison. In the end, nothing was ever proven. The most plausible theory is that it was an attempted kidnapping. Someone who knew the group's route and their camp location tried to abduct one of the boys. But when Terrence resisted, they panicked and stabbed him multiple times. What supports that theory? An adult would have had the strength to cover his mouth, which could explain why no one heard anything. Still, since Terrence had cuts on his arm, he clearly fought back, which means he must have made some noise. It's hard to imagine someone resisting silently in the middle of the night. What doesn't make sense? Well, for starters, who would risk kidnapping a child sleeping among 30 people just meters away? Sure, Terrence was on the outer edge of the circle. But still, it was a dangerous plan. And if the goal wasn't kidnapping but a straight-up execution, then maybe it makes a little more sense. But only if it was one of the person's first times committing a crime like that. Because it seemed clumsy. Stabbing a sleeping 11-year-old that many times? Clumsy in the sense of choosing such an exposed setting for it. There was a similar case involving Girl Scouts, but in that one, there were multiple victims and signs of abuse. And that brings us to the second big mystery. This one? It happened only once. And when you think about how random it was, that the killer got away without being caught, you'd think someone with that kind of mindset would feel invincible and try again. But they didn't. Want to make it even weirder? I mentioned that the morning light woke everyone up around 7:30, but in truth, there was enough light to wake up by 6 a.m., exactly when Terrence was being attacked. That only leaves two possibilities. The coroner was wrong, and the attack happened much earlier. Or that morning, many people kept their eyes shut tight, pretending to be asleep. Mystery number 2. The Cursed Lighthouse. Stories about the sea, supernatural or not, have always existed. And unlike the rest of the world, the ocean often has the power to make those stories feel real. In 2018, Sophia McKenna's ex-boyfriend, Spencer McFord, took this photo at 2 a.m. at Kaser Lighthouse, located off the southeastern coast of Connecticut. Old, weathered, and full of local legend, the lighthouse was known for being haunted by its former keeper, a man who allegedly jumped to his death from the top and whose ghost has since protected the place. It's a silly tale, maybe. But it draws people in. That was the reason they went there in the first place, to take a spooky photo at a supposedly haunted site at night. That was the adventure they had planned for the weekend, most likely fueled by a few beers, not just because Spencer already looked flushed in the photo, but also because sneaking off to a place like that at night isn't exactly responsible, especially since, to get there, they stole a small boat that belonged to the campus. Here are 2 screenshots from a video they filmed during their trip. One shows Spencer from behind, rowing toward the lighthouse. The other shows them leaving the shoreline. During the day, the sea is beautiful, but at night, as soon as you leave the city lights behind, it becomes one of the darkest and coldest places on Earth. Their little adventure started well. No one caught them stealing the boat, and they made it to the lighthouse and took this photo. Even the simple sign that said "no trespassing" was proof enough that they had made it there. But something happened, and it happened fast. Just 5 minutes after taking the picture, Spencer's phone, since Sophia's phone was left in the car, started calling her mom repeatedly. He called at 2:05, 2:06, and 2:07. At 2:08, he called 3 more times. He tried once more at 2:09, and then the calls stopped. They both disappeared. Between 6 and 7 a.m., Sophia's current boyfriend noticed she wasn't answering his calls. He saw the photo and the video she had posted, both of which only showed the departure, never their return. That's when he raised the alarm and reported them missing. 2 days later, they found the missing boat near the coast. And 2 weeks after that, Spencer's body was found floating in the water. Sophia, however, was never found. So, even though it seems fairly clear what might have happened, let's reconstruct it. When they arrived at the lighthouse, they noticed Spencer had tied his shirt to one end. It's believed he used it to anchor the boat just long enough to take the picture. But before he realized it, the boat must have come loose. Now let's be clear, that night wasn't particularly cold. The sea was calm and the waves were small. The boat was drifting, sure, but not quickly. So, considering that Spencer was a good swimmer, it wouldn't have been a big deal for him to go after it and return. He probably handed Sophia his phone and told her, "Wait here, I'll be right back." But that's when several mistakes happened. First, yes, the night wasn't especially cold, but the water was still around 11 or 12 degrees Celsius, about 52 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't take long for cold water to sap your strength. Fatigue becomes the real danger. Anxious to chase down the boat, he jumped into the sea, probably underestimating how far it had drifted. The next mistake. Even strong swimmers often misjudge distances at sea. The ocean is deceptive. Things look closer than they really are. From the lighthouse, the boat might have seemed within reach, but in the water, it wasn't. And even if he managed to reach the boat, he wouldn't have been able to row it back. Trying to climb in would likely capsize it. Whatever happened, those 4 minutes in the dark must have felt endless. Sophia, seeing Spencer not return, panicked. She started calling her mother. People find it odd that she made so many calls without leaving a voicemail. But it's really not that strange. It was the middle of the night. The repeated calls were clearly intended to wake her mom up. She didn't want to wait until morning for her to check a message. But then, what happened to Sophia? She wasn't a strong swimmer. Seeing Spencer disappear, she would never have jumped into the water by choice. If she didn't call 911, maybe it was because she didn't think it was that serious at first. And by the time she realized it was, her phone battery might have already died. Alone in the dark, screaming for someone who didn't answer. Here's the big question. Why didn't she stay in the lighthouse? There was even a staircase next to where they took the photo, leading up to a wider, safer platform. It would have been the perfect place to wait. Someone would have found her eventually. Even without the photo, they'd search there. Maybe she fantasized about swimming back to shore. It's possible. Even if she knew she wasn't a strong swimmer, panic can make us do irrational things. And again, the sea distorts distance. Another theory is that she didn't jump, but slipped. Maybe she lost her footing and fell in by accident, unable to climb back up. Whatever the case, she remains missing. And that's also strange. They found Spencer's body. They found the bodies of 2 other people who drowned nearby that same week. Sophia is the only one who never turned up. Mystery number 1. The girl who stared at the sky. She acted like she was scared of everything, paranoid almost. That's how Carly behaved during the school party held one Friday in 2018. She had smoked marijuana. It wasn't her first time. At 16 years old, she had already had a few talks with her parents about it. But she wasn't a problematic teen. She was curious, more than anything. It didn't affect her grades, and up until that night, it hadn't affected her physically either. But during that party, something changed. Her boyfriend noticed she was acting like everything terrified her. The crowd, the music, the very atmosphere, as if something awful was going to happen. She couldn't say exactly what it was, just that she felt she could die at any moment. People described her as paranoid, and it certainly looked like a psychotic episode. Maybe she had taken too much, maybe it had been laced with something. But whatever the case, she was terrified. So much so that she called her stepmother to pick her up, even if it meant facing the worst punishment of her life. They got home around 9 p.m. Her stepmother, Melissa, made her dinner and hid her phone in her pocket to secretly record Carly. The idea was to show her the video later, to use it as a teaching moment once Carly had calmed down. A questionable method, in my opinion. It can easily make someone defensive. Nobody enjoys watching themselves being mocked or vulnerable, with very few exceptions. Anyway, Carly apologized. She admitted she had made a mistake. Her stepmother told her it was okay, that everyone does things they regret sometimes. When Melissa brought her a salad, Carly hesitated. She said it was the devil's lettuce. She was scared of the salad too. She didn't want to go to sleep either. She told her stepmother she thought she was going to kill her. Melissa tried to calm her down, telling her that was ridiculous, that she would never harm her. It worked, at least a little. Carly began to settle, though she kept expressing this overwhelming fear, like something bad was going to happen no matter what. At one point, she asked, "If something bad happens to me, will you call 911?" Melissa assured her she would. Eventually, they went to bed. From here, Melissa offers two different versions of what happened next. In one version, she went to her own bed and got up twice during the night to check on Carly. Once at 5 a.m. and again at 7 a.m. In the other version, she says she slept with Carly in the same bed. In either case, when she got up at 7 a.m., Carly was gone. Not in her bed, not in the house, nowhere nearby. So, keeping her promise, Melissa called 911 because now something truly terrible had happened. Someone so scared they were terrified of everything had vanished into thin air. Witnesses said they saw her walking along a road. When asked if she looked frightened, they said she seemed surprisingly calm, but they did notice something strange. She kept looking up at the sky. They never found a body on that road. So the most likely theory is that she encountered someone who saw how vulnerable and disoriented she was and abducted her. Wandering in that state, alone, she wouldn't have gotten very far. There are other theories. Carly's biological mother cast doubt on her ex-husband and Melissa. She found it odd that when her ex called her to break the news, he said, "Carly is gone." To her, that word, gone, sounded too final, too much like dead. Later, while looking at a police map of the search area, she told them, "You're looking in the wrong place." She also claimed that in the recording, Carly begs Melissa to call 911, but Melissa refuses. Now, it's possible Carly's mother just wants to blame Melissa for not protecting her daughter, but it's still strange that she didn't call 911 herself. Your daughter is pale, wide-eyed, terrified, clearly unwell. People at the party said she looked bad. If you're her guardian, wouldn't your first instinct be to call for help? Drive her to a hospital yourself, even? In the end, the most likely explanation remains abduction. It's hard to believe that something like that could happen in broad daylight. But here's the thing, it did. This is where it happened. A desert-like area with just a few scattered houses. Carly was walking toward Highway 6. That means around 7 a.m. She was right here. This is Highway 6. She could have walked along it until she couldn't anymore. She could have been out there for hours until someone came by and picked up the girl who stared at the sky. These are two mysteries that still remain unsolved. Part 2. Number 2. A skull in plain sight. This might be one of the most obvious cases you'll ever hear, but even so, it's worth revisiting. Linda Sherman, 27 years old, and Dawn, 28, were one of those unhappy couples, the jealous, controlling kind, with a 9-year-old daughter caught in the middle. They got married because of the pregnancy. They felt obligated, and feeling obligated in a situation like that is dangerous. Time only helped reveal the mistake. Dawn was always suspicious, constantly jealous of her friends and co-workers. She, in turn, threatened him with divorce and taking their daughter away. And she actually did leave with the girl a few times, but out of emotional dependence, or simply because they had been together so long. She always ended up coming back. Once that cycle begins, the relationship is already dead. On April 22nd, 1985, Linda came home late from work, around 2 a.m., and found her husband furious. He had a song on repeat and was consumed with jealousy. Why had she stayed at work so late? Was she having an affair? From here on, all we know is what Don himself claimed. He said they argued for 2 hours. Sometime after 4 a.m., he went to bed. Linda, according to him, stayed on the couch. Later that morning, Don got up to take their daughter to school. Something Linda usually did. He said she was still asleep, face down on the sofa. Their daughter said the same. Her mom didn't say goodbye, didn't move, didn't even stir. Don went to work and returned around 6 p.m. He claimed he was surprised to see Linda still at home. She said she had overslept and needed to hurry because she was already late for work, but she never showed up to her job. When the police informed Don, his first thought was that she had run off with another man, abandoning both him and their daughter. Her car was found parked at the airport, but no tickets were purchased under her name, Linda Sherman. Coincidentally, Don said he had seen her days later in a car with another man. According to his version, it really looked like she had left with a co-worker. Naturally, the police investigated everyone around her, but found nothing. 4 years passed. Linda still hadn't been found. So Don moved on with his life, met another woman, and wanted to marry her. But legally, Linda was still missing and couldn't be declared dead until 7 years had passed. 1 year later, 5 years since Linda's disappearance, someone alerted the police that a human skull had been left on the street right in front of a restaurant. They weren't sure if it was a prank, but it looked disturbingly real. And it was. A human female skull. It was too weathered to identify. Another year passed. Now 6 years since Linda vanished. An anonymous note was sent to that same restaurant. The message was short and direct. Bridgeton police have the skull of Linda Sherman. Why that restaurant? Don said it was his favorite. He believed the killer had chosen that exact place to mess with him. That was the plan. Intimidate him, spook him enough to stop him from marrying again, but without actually hurting him. That was the big grand idea. With everything pointing in the same direction, it's almost unbelievable that someone got away with it. Yes, they suspected Don, but they never found evidence, never arrested him. And how is it possible that someone dumb enough to dig up a skull and leave a note didn't realize that only 1 more year needed to pass for Linda to be declared legally dead? How could someone that careless commit a murder and leave no trace? The note itself was odd. Blunt, direct, not the typical signature of someone who wants to be theatrical. When killers write notes, they tend to ramble. They like manifestos. This one wasn't like that. In fact, the note didn't intimidate Don at all. If anything, it helped him. Think about it. Someone deranged enough to dig up a skull 6 years later and leave it outside a restaurant, specifically his favorite, would have to know the victim well. They'd have to know Don. They'd have to know where he liked to eat, and they'd have to hate him. But not enough to kill him, just enough to murder the woman he no longer loved. Whoever did this would have known the marriage was broken. That kind of planning takes patience. And you want me to believe someone like that just stops? If I were that person, I'd go for the daughter next, or the new woman, or finally, Don himself. But of course, that man never existed. That night, in the early hours of April 22nd, during the argument, Don killed her. The setting made it easy to argue it wasn't premeditated, but that wouldn't matter. That morning, when their daughter left for school, she didn't see her mom sleeping. She saw her mom dead, face down on the couch. Later that day, Don buried the body in an unknown location. It's still never been found, and drove her car to the airport to support the runaway lover's story. But when he met another woman and wanted to get married again, he realized Linda still needed to be declared dead. So, with cold calculation, he dug up the skull and placed it outside his favorite restaurant. The note? That was just the final touch. And it worked. He got away with it. Of course, there's always the chance I'm wrong, but as the saying goes, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. An abusive husband, a wife who had threatened to leave and take their daughter, a sudden disappearance, in which, unlike previous times, she didn't take the girl with her. Everything that happened after that, the skull, the note, it all benefited Dawn. As for the daughter, she couldn't have known back then. But as she grew up, she'd realized she was raised by a murderer. Or worse, by a murderer and a fool. Because if Don's new partner couldn't see what kind of man he was and didn't realize what he had done to his previous wife, then I don't know what else to call her. Let this serve as a warning. When you want to leave a relationship that's clearly dangerous, you need to be smart about it. The most dangerous moment is always when you tell your partner you're leaving. You have to plan it, and it has to be legal. Otherwise, it's easy to fall into the trap of taking your kids without permission and confusing the system. The authorities won't know if you're in danger. What they will know is that you've committed parental abduction, I won't go into that topic now. Bringing it up always leaves a bad taste. Just take this advice. Don't make threats. Think about who you're talking to. To someone toxic, you might be the only thing they have. Not romantically, but in a twisted, possessive way. If you say you're leaving, they hear, "I'm taking everything from you." And there are people out there who don't let go without a fight. A locked room mystery. She never complained about anyone. She never said anything bad. All she wanted was to go home. That's what her father said just days after his daughter apparently took her own life inside her apartment. And if that were true, this would be one of the strangest cases you'll ever hear. At first glance, it looked impossible. But then again, it also looked impossible that someone else could have killed her. That's why, even though she was found with 20 stab wounds, some shallow, some to the back of her neck, the police ultimately ruled it a suicide, because both the front door and the window were locked from the inside. Her name was Ellen Greenberg. She was a school teacher about to get married. In fact, she had mailed out her wedding invitations just 4 days earlier. She wasn't someone people described as anxious. But as the wedding approached, her mood changed. Her family, her friends, her co-workers, all of them noticed a shift. And yes, it's normal to feel nervous before a wedding, but not like this. Not to this extent, and it wasn't all because of the wedding. Her psychiatrist said her job as a teacher was overwhelming her. He initially prescribed Zoloft and Xanax, but saw no progress. Later, he switched to Klonopin, and things seemed to improve. In his notes, he wrote, "The patient is beginning to think about other things." Another note stated, "Not suicidal," and finally, "Much better." Ellen herself wrote to her mom saying Klonopin had helped her. Her mom replied, "That makes me so happy, sweetheart." And Ellen said, "Me too." But that progress didn't last. The very next day, things seemed to fall apart again. Just one day before her death, Ellen's mom encouraged her to stay in therapy. She responded, "Okay, I'll keep trying. I'm just a little scared of everything right now." On the day it happened, Ellen was at home with her fiancé, Samuel Goldberg. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, he left to go to the gym. Not for long, just 30 minutes. When he came back, he couldn't get in. The door was locked from the inside, not just the deadbolt, but the security latch too. He knocked, but she didn't answer. He tried calling. Nothing. So he started texting her, each message more aggressive than the last. He didn't know if she was ignoring him, if she had fallen asleep, or if she was trying to punish him for something he couldn't remember. His messages included, "Open the door. What are you doing? I'm getting pissed. Hello? And you better have a good excuse." He sent those texts over the course of 22 minutes. Then, finally, he ran downstairs and asked the building's security guard, Philip Hampton, to help him break in. The guard knew Samuel, but refused to help. Most likely, he figured it was a couple's argument and didn't want to get involved. He probably suggested calling a locksmith. He probably assumed Ellen was inside and had locked the door on purpose. Still, once he saw Samuel really trying to get in, he followed him upstairs. Samuel forced the door open, and there was Ellen lying on the kitchen floor, bleeding with a knife in her chest. They called 911. For every detail that screams, "It was the fiancé," there's another that says, "It couldn't have been." Let's break it down. 20 stab wounds, all in the kitchen. Most were to the neck and chest, with 1 or 2 to the head. She wasn't sexually assaulted. Nothing was missing from the apartment. It wasn't a robbery. There was no suicide note either. But here's where things get even stranger. Ellen had been cutting an orange right before it happened. So either she was attacked while holding the knife, or she dropped it and used it on herself. The door was locked from the inside, and so was the window. The building had security cameras, and no one else was seen entering or leaving except Samuel. Even if you could explain how someone else locked the door from the outside. Ellen had no defensive wounds. She never tried to block the attacks with her hands or her arms. She never once complained about Samuel, only about work and the stress of the wedding. She spoke with her mother that very day and sounded calm. Not the kind of calm you'd expect from someone planning to end their life in just a few minutes. And then there's the browsing history. This part can be a clue or a trap. A week before she died, Ellen had been Googling things. Some of them were normal, though not recommended, like looking up side effects of her medications. Others were more concerning. On December 18, 2010, she visited the Wikipedia page for methods of suicide, specifically looking into suffocation. On January 3rd, she compared the side effects of Prozac and Zoloft. On January 6th and 9th, she visited a forum about how Zoloft can cause weight gain and found a post about a girl who electrocuted herself in the bathtub while trying to send a tweet. That incident had happened in 2009. The girl tried to plug in her laptop while in the tub and was found with a burn on her palm. Ellen looked at the photo of the girl and kept browsing. On January 10th, the day before she died, she searched for an article opposing euthanasia, then quick suicide methods, and finally, painless suicide. After that, she stopped. That same day, she told her mom she was feeling better. No more dark searches. And then 16 days later, she was dead on the kitchen floor. So the question is, if she wanted a painless way to die, why choose something as brutal as stabbing? And if Samuel was the one who made those searches behind her back, that would mean he was a mastermind, preparing a digital trail that would frame her as suicidal. But even if that were true, why would someone so calculated kill her in such a suspicious way? 20 stab wounds while she's cutting fruit? That doesn't make sense. And if he hated her that much, she would have noticed. Rage like that doesn't appear overnight, not in a couple that's supposedly about to get married. Of course, there's the final possibility, that she really did do it herself. It sounds unbelievable, but there are rare cases where people use horrifying methods. Chainsaws, table saws, even hammers. Yes, even stabbing themselves. These are real cases, though extremely rare. Officially, Ellen's death was ruled as suicide. But understandably, many believe the fiancé found a way to do it, without leaving a mark, without getting caught. Maybe he did the searches. Maybe he staged the locked door. Maybe he found a way to leave no defensive wounds. Maybe, or maybe, she really did take her own life in the most shocking way imaginable. These are 3 mysteries that remain unsolved. Part 3. Kevin Martin. Kevin Martin walked out of his house one day without telling anyone in his family. He was only 13. And it wasn't the first time he'd done it. He wasn't a bad kid. He was kind to his family, polite at school. But ever since his brother had died in a tragic house fire, something in him had changed. He started leaving home without warning, skipping school, and trying to earn the approval of the popular kids. He wanted to be part of their group. Everyone knew deep down he wasn't like them. The loss of his brother still weighed on him. He craved belonging. And he seemed to find it among the troubled kids. He had gone out without permission before. But that day, he didn't come back. At first, he was reported missing. Then they found his body, buried in a shallow grave. No one could say who did it or why someone would believe a 13-year-old deserved to die. Based on the details, I have 2 theories. The first is about the grave. Its shallow depth points to improvisation. Whoever killed him likely didn't plan to dispose of a body. So they dug a quick grave after the murder, probably in a panic, afraid of being discovered. The second theory comes from the fact that there were no other murders. That could mean Kevin was the killer's first victim, and the violence shocked them more than they expected. And no, it wasn't an accident. The condition of the body made it clear. This was intentional. And the more I look at it, the more obvious it seems it had to be those new friends. Let's explore the possibility of a serial killer. Look at where Kevin lived. A tiny town, houses far apart, and just 2 blocks from home, you'd find yourself in complete isolation. It's the perfect place for a textbook psychopath. Kevin wasn't the only kid who snuck out of the house. Someone like that would have known the families and might have struck again. But no, it never happened. If it had been an adult, it would only make sense if it was an accident and they buried the body out of fear. But again, the wounds proved it wasn't accidental. It's hard to believe an adult could kill a kid like that and then stop forever. It reminds me of the first mystery we covered, the Boy Scout boy. If someone had the cold blood to kill a 13-year-old without motive or consequence, why stop? Unless there was a motive. But Kevin wasn't the kind of kid to cause trouble. The group he joined? Sure. They had probably made a lot of people angry, and yet no one ever laid a finger on them. That leaves only one possibility. They were the ones who did it, that new group of friends. But there's one more detail I haven't mentioned, and it changes everything. Kevin's body wasn't found near his town. It was discovered 43 minutes away by car near a factory. It's clear he didn't walk that far on his own. Someone took him, alive or dead. They drove him out, buried him, and left. Introducing an adult into this theory changes everything. Someone who drives 43 minutes away instead of burying the body nearby is trying to make it look like Kevin simply disappeared. The act of removing him from town suggests that the kidnapping and murder happened in town because Kevin wouldn't have wandered that far on his own. There was nothing out there for him. So let's recap this version. It wasn't random. Someone didn't just spot him walking and decide to kidnap him. They abducted him in town, drove away, didn't abuse him, killed him, and buried him. Wait, what? I'm not proud of it, but over the years I've seen a lot of cases like this, and two details here make that scenario highly unlikely. Not impossible, but extremely improbable. Here's why. Adults who target kids, especially young teens, usually do it for one reason: abuse. Think of names like Luis Garavito, the monster of the Andes, John Wayne Gacy, the clown, Sir the German watchmaker Siegfried Fehmer. In those cases, it wouldn't be odd to bury the body. Those types often feel ashamed and want to hide what they've done. But Kevin hadn't been abused. That small detail changes everything. Driving 43 minutes now takes on a different meaning. This is just a theory, and there could be dozens more, including some in your own head. But here's mine. The kids he had been hanging out with killed him. Maybe it was semi-accidental. Maybe they didn't realize what they'd done. Doesn't matter. Someone panicked and told their parents, and the parent, seeing the situation, decided to take the body, hide it far away, and make it look like Kevin had run away to protect their child and themselves. It sounds cold, I know, but the strangest things happen in the smallest towns. And this theory explains everything. Why there were no more murders. Why the grave was shallow. Why someone drove 43 minutes just to bury a body. It may sound wild, but compare it to the alternative. That some random person passed through a small town, kidnapped a boy, didn't abuse him, killed him, and buried him far away as if it served some purpose for someone who didn't even live there. As for the motive, it could have been anything. Kevin tried hard to fit into that group, and they probably took advantage of him. Maybe they mocked his dead brother. Maybe it led to a fight he couldn't win. Maybe it started out as a prank and ended in tragedy. And unless someone talks, we'll never know. Small towns know how to keep their secrets. A message hidden in the wall. Sometimes a mystery is more tragic than puzzling. Sometimes the only real question is how no one noticed. It all started when the owners of a small building decided to remodel one of the apartments. It had been vacant for a while, and they wanted to renovate it and rent it out. They hired a contractor and his team to get the work done. Everything was going fine until they started tearing down one of the walls. That's when they found it. It was a message, written in red ink. Not painted, not carved, just a sentence written by hand, as if someone had scribbled it desperately and no one had noticed. It said, "I'm trapped in the apartment. Help me." At first, the workers thought it was a joke, a prank left by the previous tenant or a twisted attempt at humor by someone who'd worked there before. But something about it didn't feel right. It was too simple, too raw, and too hidden. It was written in the space between two layers of wall. That meant someone had written it before the wall was sealed, and then, for some reason, no one had seen it again, until now. The owners were contacted immediately. They didn't take it seriously. They said no one had ever lived there with mental issues, that no one had gone missing, that it was impossible. They even laughed about it until the contractor decided to knock down more of the wall. Behind it, they found something else. Another wall, and then behind that wall, they found something worse. Bones. Human remains. They called the police. The news never made national headlines, but it was big enough to shake the town. A woman had disappeared 5 years earlier. She had been renting that apartment. Her boyfriend had said she packed her bags and left one night without saying a word. No one saw her again. The investigation went cold. No signs of violence, no body, no trace. But now, with the remains discovered in the wall, everything changed. They identified the body through dental records. It was her. And the worst part, the part that still haunts me, is this. That message wasn't written with a marker. It wasn't even ink. It was blood. A paranoid decision. She acted like she was scared of everything. Paranoid almost. That's how Carly behaved during the school party held one Friday in 2018. She had smoked marijuana. It wasn't her first time. At 16 years old, she had already had a few talks with her parents about it. But she wasn't a problematic teen. She was curious more than anything. It didn't affect her grades, and up until that night, it hadn't affected her physically either. But during that party, something changed. Her boyfriend noticed she was acting like everything terrified her. The crowd, the music, the very atmosphere, as if something awful was going to happen. She couldn't say exactly what it was, just that she felt she could die at any moment. People described her as paranoid, and it certainly looked like a psychotic episode. Maybe she had taken too much. Maybe it had been laced with something. But whatever the case, she was terrified. So much so that she called her stepmother to pick her up, even if it meant facing the worst punishment of her life. They got home around 9 o'clock. She was still scared, still talking nonsense, still shaking. Her stepmom tried to calm her down. Her dad was upstairs. Carly stayed on the couch. The idea was to let her rest and check on her in a while. But when her dad came down, Carly wasn't there. The door was wide open, and she didn't have a phone. The search started immediately. Family, friends, and volunteers combed through streets, nearby parks, and wooded areas. After 4 days, the police found something, a hoodie, in the middle of a forest. But Carly wasn't there. More time passed. Then they found her shoes, perfectly placed side by side, not kicked off or scattered, but almost intentionally positioned. And again, Carly wasn't there. Then finally, a week later, they found her body, floating in a lake. No signs of violence. She had drowned. The authorities closed the case. It was an accident, but to this day, her parents still don't believe that. Not because of the drug or the paranoia, but because of the trail she left behind. She left her clothes as if trying to leave a message. A hoodie, then her shoes, then her body. It's like she was dropping breadcrumbs to be found. But here's the thing. If she was trying to be found, why was she walking into the woods in the first place? Her father doesn't know. No one does. Maybe she felt the world was collapsing. Maybe she thought someone was coming for her. Maybe she thought she was infected or cursed. Or maybe she just wanted to disappear. But if that was the case, if she wanted to disappear, why call her stepmom and go home? This story feels like a tragic accident, and maybe that's all it is. But in my gut, I think she was trying to say something. That the way she placed her shoes wasn't random. That the way she left was a decision, maybe not a conscious one, but a decision nonetheless. These are 6 innocent people who ended up in prison. The dilemma of the innocent prisoner. One of the greatest fears you can have in court is receiving a sentence based on a false accusation and watching the evidence and witness statements point straight at you. There's no worse feeling than knowing you didn't do anything, and that there's nothing you can do to avoid going to prison. You feel like the whole world is against you, like everyone accusing you is wrong, and the justice system is failing you. That's why people often quote that famous phrase by William Blackstone. It is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. Statistically, it sounds odd, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. It only applies to cases where there's reasonable doubt. And thankfully, those aren't as common as they seem. Put simply, when in doubt, let them go. With such a sensitive subject, we expect maximum accuracy. We expect no innocent person to end up behind bars. But we're not machines. And sadly, even with the best intentions, serious mistakes have been made. Mistakes that ruined lives. Mistakes that still happen today. Not just in the past. Lies, errors, hidden evidence. A web of failure that continues to trap the innocent. Case number 6. Ricky Jackson. He spent 39 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. The injustice was so blatant that the state of Ohio awarded him $1 million in compensation. But let's be real. How could that possibly make up for it? Almost an entire lifetime locked away for a sum that doesn't come close to restoring what was lost. There's no way to compensate for time, because time doesn't come back. And yet, Ricky was grateful. Over the years, he came to accept what happened. During the first 5 or 6 years, all he could feel was rage, fear, and helplessness. But eventually, he accepted it as something beyond his control. He was released in 2015 at the age of 58. He had been just 19 when they locked him up. And all it took to convict him, all it took to sentence him to death, was the statement of a 13-year-old boy. That's it. No other witnesses, no physical evidence, just the word of a kid. That boy, Eddie Vernon, claimed he saw Jackson and 2 other boys at the store where a clerk had been murdered. Authorities said it was a robbery. The 3 young men were sentenced to death. Luckily, due to procedural delays, the executions were postponed long enough for the truth to surface. A group called the Innocence Project got involved, and in a twist of fate, it was that same boy, Eddie Vernon, who helped set Ricky free. He finally admitted he had lied. The police had pressured him. They forced him to say what they wanted. Surprised, a black man sent to prison because the police wanted it that way? Years later, Eddie retracted his statement. But that alone wasn't enough. He had to make it official, with a sworn declaration before a judge. That's the danger of coerced testimony. The pressure from the police can be so overwhelming that it doesn't just break witnesses. It can even make the accused believe they're guilty. People crumble under that kind of force. Some confess to crimes they never committed, just to make it stop. And that's where the real dilemma begins. Once the system labels someone as guilty, the rules change. In some countries, inmates can have their sentences reduced if they admit guilt and express remorse. But if they insist they're innocent, the system treats them as unrepentant, as if they're in denial, and that denial is often enough to keep them behind bars. So what do you do if you're truly innocent? Admit to something you didn't do just to get out, or stand your ground and risk staying in prison forever? Many innocent people, faced with that impossible choice, have confessed just to be free. And once you say you're guilty, proving your innocence becomes even harder. Only a few chose their dignity over their freedom. They refused to lie. They kept their pride intact, and many of them died in prison. Michael Shirley. Michael Shirley was barely 18 years old when he was sentenced to life in prison. He spent 16 years locked up for a crime he didn't commit. The worst part? He had a solid alibi, but the police didn't believe him, and the system, once again, failed. The story begins in 1986. A woman named Linda Cook was brutally assaulted and murdered near her home in Portsmouth, England. It was a horrible crime. The press ran with it. People were desperate to find a suspect. The police were under pressure, and Michael Shirley became the perfect scapegoat. He was young, lived nearby, and had a bit of a rebellious streak, so they pinned it on him. The investigation was rushed. The evidence? Flimsy at best. Witnesses placed him at the scene, but they were mistaken. Michael insisted he had been out drinking that night with friends, and not just at any time, but during the exact window when the crime took place. He even had friends who backed up his story. But it didn't matter. The jury believed the prosecution, and Michael went to prison. For 16 years, he maintained his innocence. Over and over again. He refused to confess. He refused to show remorse for something he hadn't done, and because of that, he was denied parole. He'd spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. because he told the truth. Then in 2002, a breakthrough. DNA evidence. A test that hadn't existed at the time of the trial now had the power to overturn everything. The new analysis proved conclusively that the DNA found on Linda Cook's body did not belong to Michael. It belonged to someone else. Someone they never identified. Michael was finally exonerated. He was freed. But by then, he had lost everything. His youth, his opportunities, his trust in the system. He was 34 years old, and the world had moved on without him. He later said that the most painful part wasn't prison itself. It was knowing that no matter how loudly he shouted the truth, no one listened. No one believed him. Until science did. Archie Williams. In 1983, a woman was assaulted and stabbed in her own home. She survived, but the trauma changed her forever. During the investigation, she was shown a group of photos, mugshots. One of them was of Archie Williams, a young black man who had already been arrested before, but for unrelated reasons. The victim hesitated, then pointed at him. That was all it took. Her statement was enough to send him to prison for 37 years. Archie insisted he was innocent, and he was. But at that time, no one listened. The prosecution was aggressive. They wanted someone to blame, and Archie, young, poor, and black, fit the profile. The fingerprint found at the scene? It wasn't his. In fact, it didn't match anyone in the police database at the time. But instead of interpreting that as a red flag, the court allowed it to be overlooked, and Archie went to prison. He was 22. He wouldn't see freedom again until he was 59. In all those years, he never stopped saying the same thing: I didn't do it. And then one day, someone listened. The Innocence Project took on his case. They demanded that the fingerprint be tested again, this time against an expanded national database. And guess what? They got a hit. The print belonged to Stephen Forbes, a serial offender who had committed other crimes in similar circumstances. That was the proof they needed. Archie was released in 2019, and when he stepped out of prison, the world welcomed him in a way he never expected. One of his greatest passions was music, and just months after his release, he was invited to perform on America's Got Talent. His voice, filled with pain, experience, and dignity, moved millions. For the first time in his life, he was seen not as a suspect, but as a man. The most powerful part of his story isn't the mistake, it's what he chose to do with it. Archie forgave, he rebuilt, and he became a symbol of resilience. Not everyone survives 37 years of injustice with their soul intact. Archie did, and he never let it take away his will to sing. Juan Rivera. This story happened in 1992. An 11-year-old girl named Holly Staker was found dead in her own home. She had been assaulted, beaten, and murdered. The case shocked the entire city of Waukegan, Illinois. The police launched a massive investigation. Public pressure was enormous, and soon they had a suspect, a teenager named Juan Rivera. He was just 19 years old. He had a minor criminal record, mostly for theft, but nothing violent. That didn't matter. The police brought him in, questioned him for hours, and claimed he confessed. But here's the thing. That confession didn't make sense. It was full of contradictions. He said he'd used a key to enter the apartment, but there was no sign of forced entry and no key was ever found. He said he'd been with the girl before the crime, but the timeline didn't match. His entire statement was a mess. But the police said it was good enough, and the jury agreed. Juan Rivera was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the truth is even more disturbing. He didn't just go to trial once. He was convicted 3 times in 3 separate trials for the same crime. In each one, the same faulty evidence was presented. The same manipulated confession was used, and in each one, he maintained his innocence. Years passed, technology improved, and in 2005, they finally tested the DNA found at the scene. It wasn't Juan's, not even close. Still, prosecutors insisted he was guilty. They argued that maybe she had been with someone else before the attack, that the DNA didn't prove anything. It was absurd. They refused to back down. It wasn't until 2012, 20 years after the crime, that Juan Rivera was finally exonerated. His lawyers proved that the confession had been coerced, that the timeline didn't fit, that the DNA excluded him completely, and that the real killer had never been found. Juan was released after 2 decades in prison. He later received $20 million in compensation, but the scars remain. He spoke openly about the trauma of being locked up for something he didn't do, about losing his youth, about watching the world move on without him, and about the mental collapse he suffered while behind bars. He wasn't the only victim of this case. Justice was denied for Holly Staker as well, because while Juan sat in prison, the real killer was free. Rafael Riccardi. Rafael Riccardi spent 13 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And unlike the others on this list, he wasn't in the United States. His case took place in Spain. It happened in 1995. Rafael was accused of raping a woman. The evidence? Her word alone. She had described her attacker with a few physical traits, and Rafael, unfortunately, matched them. That was enough. Even though he had an alibi, even though he insisted he had never seen that woman before in his life. The judge still believed her. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 13. And then one day, after over a decade behind bars, something happened. The court approved a request to reanalyze the evidence, this time using DNA testing, and that changed everything. The results proved that Rafael Riccardi was innocent. He hadn't touched that woman. He hadn't even been near her. The case fell apart, and he was finally released. Now let me ask you something. How much would you expect in compensation for spending 13 years of your life in prison for something you didn't do? €1 million? 2? Rafael received €120,000. That's less than $10,000 per year behind bars, less than minimum wage, for having his entire life taken from him. When asked how he felt, Rafael said he wasn't angry anymore. He said that, at first, all he wanted was revenge, that he dreamt of getting back at the people who put him there. But over time, he realized that holding on to hate would only destroy him. He chose peace. He chose to start over. But there's a detail that very few people know, something that makes this case even sadder. During his time in prison, Rafael suffered a traumatic brain injury after falling from the top bunk in his cell. He hit his head, lost consciousness, and woke up with permanent neurological damage. Today, he lives with a disability that affects his coordination and speech. He never fully recovered. So let's recap. Rafael lost 13 years of his freedom. He was labeled a rapist. He suffered brain damage, and the people who convicted him never faced consequences. Not one. Richard Phillips. Richard Phillips holds a tragic record. He is the person who spent the most years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 46 years. Almost half a century behind bars, being innocent. It all started in 1971. A man named Gregory Harris was found murdered near Detroit. The police quickly identified 2 suspects, Richard Phillips and a man named Richard Palumbo. The evidence? Circumstantial at best. The real key to the conviction was Palumbo's testimony. He blamed Phillips. That's all it took. Richard was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He was 27 years old. He wouldn't be free again until he was 73. For decades, he insisted on his innocence. He never changed his story. He didn't ask for reduced time. He didn't confess. He didn't beg for mercy. He simply said over and over again, "I didn't do it." And then, in 2010, something incredible happened. Palumbo, the man who had blamed him, confessed that he had lied. He admitted that Richard had nothing to do with the crime, that he had only said what he said to cut a deal, that he had sacrificed someone else's life to save his own. At first, the courts didn't believe him, but the Innocence Clinic at the University of Michigan took the case. They investigated. They reopened the file. They interviewed witnesses. And finally, in 2018, 46 years after his arrest, Richard Phillips was exonerated and set free. When journalists asked him what he would do now, his answer surprised everyone. He said, "I'm going to paint." and that's what he did. During his time in prison, he had taught himself to draw and paint. Watercolors, mostly, and he continued after being released. Now, let me tell you something that speaks volumes about his character. Richard never received financial compensation from the state, not right away. While the legal process dragged on, he had no income and no house, no savings, nothing. So he started selling his paintings online, not for a lot, just enough to live. He didn't complain, he didn't lash out, he just moved forward. Eventually, in 2020, the state of Michigan awarded him $1.5 million for the wrongful conviction. But no money, no matter how much, could give him back the 46 years they stole. The family he lost, the opportunities he missed, the time that never returned. Richard Phillips could have come out bitter, but instead, he came out peaceful. He said that prison taught him patience, that solitude helped him understand himself, and that, while he doesn't forgive the system, he forgives the man who lied. Because hate, he says, is just another prison. The mystery. Sherlock Holmes. Never solved. There must always be a mystery that stands out above the rest, not just twisted and complicated, but real. This was not one of Arthur Conan Doyle's countless creations, the kind Sherlock Holmes would solve almost effortlessly. It was a real event that happened a long time ago and was never resolved. A police force that manipulated everything. A maid who acted strangely. 2 diamond brooches that looked almost identical. A man who had the bad luck of resembling the killer. A dozen witnesses whose photographic memory turned out to be far worse than they believed, and an Arthur Conan Doyle who knew something didn't fit. It happened in 1908. Marion Gilchrist, an 83-year-old unmarried woman, was at home alone, sitting in the living room with her glasses on, reading a magazine. She wasn't always alone. She had a maid, Helen, who helped her with the household chores. But at that moment, Helen had gone out to buy the newspaper, as she always did at 7 o'clock sharp in the evening. Arthur Adams, a neighbor and friend, was in the living room of his own house with his sisters when they heard a very loud noise coming from upstairs, from Mrs. Gilchrist's home, followed by 3 more loud knocks. She was an elderly lady who didn't like receiving visitors, but it had been said that if one day she fell and needed help, she would knock on the floor with her shoe several times as a signal. Adams went to check on her after hearing the sound, not because he felt obligated, but because it was loud enough to genuinely worry him. The door that led to the street was open. He didn't have to ring the bell. He went up the stairs and knocked on the door 3 times, but no one answered. He pressed his ear against it and could hear something that sounded like wood breaking, but nothing else. Hearing that, he thought it might be the maid making repairs and went back to his house. His sisters told him that while he was knocking, they had heard more noise, as if there was someone inside, but no one opened the door. They were concerned and told him to try again. He went back to the door, but this time he couldn't hear anything. It had gone completely silent. While he was concentrating, trying to distinguish any sound, the street door opened and he saw Helen, the maid, returning from buying the newspaper. He told her they had heard a loud noise in the house, and she said it was probably the kitchen clothesline pulleys coming loose. Adams wasn't convinced, so he stayed with her to check, now that he knew Helen hadn't been at home. Mrs. Gilchrist could have fallen. They opened the door and stood for a few seconds in the entryway without hearing anything, but as Helen headed toward the kitchen, they saw a man come out of one of the rooms. He walked calmly toward Arthur, and Arthur thought he was going to greet him, but instead, the man sidestepped quickly and ran down the stairs. Helen didn't ask who he was. She didn't seem surprised enough to go back to the door. Instead, she went to the kitchen to check her theory and said everything was fine. Adams, however, remained uneasy, and the fact that the man didn't say a single word and ran off only made things worse. He asked Helen where Mrs. Gilchrist was. They found her in the same place she had been before being left alone, in the dining room, but lying on the floor, lifeless. The magazine was still on the table, but her glasses were no longer on her face. They had been folded and left next to the magazine. Arthur ran down the stairs to try to catch the man, but by then he had disappeared. The windows and doors were closed. No locks had been forced. The investigation revealed that only one piece of jewelry was missing, a gold brooch set with diamonds. In one of the rooms, several documents were scattered on the floor, taken from a smashed wooden box. Her behavior was strange. Arthur himself told the police she hadn't seemed surprised to see a man leaving the house. She hadn't asked who he was, and they only began looking for Mrs. Gilchrist when he asked where she was. Later, when she had to describe the man, she gave two completely different versions. One initial account that matched Arthur's, and another that was similar to the description given by another witness. But it wasn't only her behavior. What came next was just as puzzling. Shortly afterward, a man was arrested for trying to sell a gold brooch with diamonds. Oscar Slater, an unfortunate man addicted to gambling and burdened with debts. They conducted a lineup, and both Helen and Arthur pointed to Slater as the one who looked most like the man they had seen. Neighbors who had noticed a stranger watching Gilchrist's house also identified him. A gambler, a bit of money trouble, and a suspect conveniently fitting the role. It was all too easy. The police acted with speed, with efficiency, and with an anger that seemed eager to close the case. He was sentenced to death. But suspicion that he was not the true culprit spread far enough to reduce his sentence to life in prison. Conan Doyle published a small work called The Case of Oscar Slater. In it, he recounted the entire story in detail, the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, and the reasons he believed Slater was not guilty. 2 years later, a private investigation was carried out, and Detective Thompson Trench revealed information that nearly cost him his freedom. He claimed the trial had been a spectacle, that the police had hidden evidence and pressured both Helen and Adams to accuse Slater. When they discovered what Trench was doing, they tried to do to him what would later be done to Julian Assange. Fabricated charges suddenly appeared, aimed at sending him to prison. Fortunately, they didn't succeed. In his case, the police's actions were far too blatant. It was clear to him. Slater was not the man. Witnesses had spoken of a person who had been watching Gilchrist's house for weeks, but they could not agree on his appearance, neither on his face nor on his clothing. The maid and the neighbor who crossed paths with him weren't certain either. She had seen only one side of his face, and Arthur wasn't wearing his glasses. The image they had was blurry, despite having been face to face with him. This, along with not asking the right questions, nearly got Slater executed. In many cases, the witnesses did not say, "That is the man I saw," but rather, "He looks a lot like the man I saw." Then there was the most obvious reason. The brooch Slater had tried to sell was not the same one. A friend had given it to him to pawn. The police had known this from the start, but they didn't care. They forced the machinery to make him the perfect scapegoat. They had found a poor man who could not defend himself. What they didn't expect was that the case would attract the curiosity of many, including Conan Doyle himself, who had plenty to say. As for who actually committed the crime, no one ever found out. Much of the blame lay with the police. It was said there was a more plausible suspect, the son of someone with influential friends. The choice was between angering a powerful person or going after a penniless gambler with debts. We know which one they chose. One of the most accepted theories is that someone very close to her killed her. The motive is the most intriguing part. Apparently, it wasn't for the jewelry. In the bedroom dresser, besides the brooch, there were diamond rings, a gold pendant, a watch, a gold bracelet, and all of it was ignored. Only the brooch was taken, so perhaps the main interest was the documents. There's no other explanation. I thought the same, but they weren't taken nor destroyed. Whoever it was, they killed her brutally, rummaged through some documents, took the brooch, and miraculously left. Remember, there was no sign of forced entry. An elderly, wealthy woman letting someone into her home, despite the mistrust common in older people, especially those with money, meant that she must have known them. She was no exception. She was quite paranoid about being robbed. And it seems she had reason to be. The list of suspects was short, friends and family. A very short list for someone who rarely received visitors. The house was not searched. The person went directly to the room with the wooden box. They seemed to know exactly where and what to look for. Somehow they knew she kept her jewelry in a box in the wardrobe, though very few people knew this. But their information was limited. They knew about a box, but not which box. Why friends and family? Because she didn't like to talk about her jewelry, much less where she kept it. It had to be someone close, someone who knew what to look for. The only thing they hadn't counted on was neighbors knocking insistently at the door. Without that, they probably would have had enough time. All right, let's imagine the suspect Conan Doyle referred to. He thought it was possible the killer had duplicated the keys. There would be no forced door, no screams from the woman, because she might have thought it was the maid who had forgotten something. She would only realize the truth upon seeing him in the doorway of the dining room, and before she could finish asking who he was, he would have attacked her. So far, it all fits. He gets nervous seeing the old woman try to call for help, searches the box but doesn't find the jewelry, glances over the dresser, and under the pressure of the neighbor knocking, takes only the brooch upon hearing the door open. Perhaps he had also planned to attack the maid, but seeing another person there made him change his mind. When he heard footsteps, he walked out as calmly as possible, but as soon as he passed them, he bolted down the stairs. The only thing that remains unexplained in this theory is why someone who had keys would choose to act in such a short time frame, knowing there were better opportunities, when the maid had the day off or during longer errands. Remember, the neighbors had seen a man watching the house for weeks. He would have known this. It doesn't add up for someone with keys. Without going into detail, the attack was brutal, many blows to the head. Yet despite this, the rest of the house was spotless. That tells us two things. The attack occurred in the living room, and somehow the killer didn't get their hands dirty. This was an attack driven by panic. If we remember what Adams and his sisters said, there was one very loud noise, the fall, followed by 3 more blows. Those 3 were the woman trying to signal for help. The man must have become enraged upon seeing her do this and continued attacking her on the floor. Those would be the blows the sisters heard while Arthur was knocking at the door. Ironically, the ferocity of the attack made even more noise. He acted out of panic. He had no experience. How did he manage to do it without getting blood on his hands? There was talk of gloves, but someone trapped in that situation would act impulsively, and stealing only one piece of jewelry points to someone very nervous, poorly prepared. He almost certainly hadn't intended to attack her that way. In his mind, the plan had been enter, deliver a blow to the head to knock her unconscious, and take the jewelry. What he actually did was enter, deliver a blow to the head, see her trying to call for help, and then... Conan Doyle thought he might have used a chair. If you look closely, the chairs in her home were sturdy, and that would mean he wouldn't have to soil his hands. Did the maid know what was going to happen? I don't think so. She would have taken much longer to return with the newspaper, and it wouldn't make sense to have the house watched if she were complicit. The idea does come to mind when you think about how strangely she behaved upon entering the house. So wrapped up in her role of pretending not to know what was happening that she forgot to react naturally. She didn't seem surprised, didn't approach to ask who the man was, didn't try to stop him, just ignored him and continued toward the kitchen. If you ran into someone in the street, you'd at least acknowledge them, let alone when you're taking care of a person you know doesn't receive and doesn't want to receive visitors. The surprise should have been doubled. When the neighbor told her he had heard something above them, the first thing Helen said was that something must have fallen in the kitchen. Here, take a look at the layout of the house. The kitchen is here, the living room is here. It's notable that the first thing she thought of was that the noise had to be in the kitchen and that some pulleys falling in a distant place could make a sound loud enough to alarm the neighbors. And that's another thing. Even if it was an explanation given without much thought, why didn't she immediately go check? You're caring for an elderly person, you see a worried neighbor, and you see a stranger leaving the house. The natural reaction would be to make sure nothing had happened, not to brush it off. That girl surely kept some secret. Of that I'm certain, but perhaps out of fear, she stayed silent. Some accounts say she stole documents and that these were the will, but reading the book The Trial of Oscar Slater, there's no mention of missing documents. It only says they were scattered on the floor, nothing more. It wasn't an important detail because the killer's knowledge was just enough to know the jewelry was kept in a box in the bedroom, but not precise enough to know exactly which box. How did Slater supposedly know about the jewelry when so few people did? Did he overhear it? And how did he enter the house? It doesn't matter. His clothing wasn't stained during the attack, which is relevant. And of course, the brooch he tried to sell was not the same one. These are not minor details. There are inconsistencies in the witnesses' statements, and the maid changed her description of the suspect. And yet, they still managed to send a man to prison for 18 years. This paints a picture of someone careful, meticulous, who had been watching them for weeks to learn their routines, and yet chose the worst possible moment to act. When she went out to buy the newspaper, it left a window of barely 10 minutes. Why not choose Thursday night when the maid wasn't home? Why not choose a time when she went shopping and took longer? He would have known these things if he had been watching for weeks. If he risked acting in such a short window, it's because it was his only option. That means it had to be at 7 to be able to trick her. Seeing Helen leave and immediately knocking so the old woman would think the maid had forgotten her keys and would open the door. If he was unlucky and she was suspicious, he would simply leave. If she let him in, he would do what he came to do. With that, we know the duplicate key theory could not have been the case. He would have chosen another moment. As for how he got in, that mystery is far from solved. There's a detail I've been holding back on purpose. The sides of the door leading into the house were made of glass. You could see who was at the door without opening it. That's why Conan Doyle believed the only alternative, crazy as it sounded, was duplicate keys. Because a lone elderly woman afraid of being robbed would, at the very least, look through the glass before opening the door. And if it was a familiar face, we're back to the earlier point. She would have chosen the worst possible time to open it. If I had to suggest one possibility, I'd say it was a family member. As I mentioned earlier, it would be someone who knew about the jewelry from stories told by other family members. It could have been a son, a brother, or a nephew. I'm fairly certain she had no children, so the most likely would be a brother or his children, a nephew. But given that the man seen was around his 30s, it would have been a nephew. What's harder to determine is whether the idea came from the brothers to claim the inheritance or solely from the nephew with the intention of stealing the jewelry. If it were the first, they wouldn't waste time looking for jewelry, since with no children, the brothers were direct beneficiaries. There would be no need to steal them. That's why I lean toward the second. The nephew, who knew about the jewelry, but in the end took only the brooch because he panicked. And just like the killer, that piece of jewelry was never found. The coroner didn't mince words. He couldn't say who the man was. He didn't know the cause of death, nor whether it had been a murder. A nurse named Jessica Thompson had been able to see the face of this unknown man. The young woman seemed unsettled. Her eyes widened. She trembled slightly, turned her gaze away and refused to look at him again. She seemed so shaken that those around her thought she might faint. It gave the impression that she recognized him. As she wiped away sweat, they waited impatiently for her to say his name. But instead, she swore she didn't know who the man was, claimed she had never seen him before. Still, it was obvious she seemed to know something. She was about to get married. Perhaps he was an ex-boyfriend she wanted to forget. They thought that in time she would tell them who he was, but she never did. If she knew something, or if her reaction was purely involuntary, she took it to her grave. They first saw him at 7 in the evening on the last day of November in 1948. It was a warm day, and John Lyons and his wife had decided to take a walk along Somerton Beach. During their walk, John noticed a man lying on the sand. And he remembered him clearly because he was fully dressed in a suit and shoes, an unusual outfit for lying on the beach. The man in the suit seemed to be raising his hand, as if pointing toward the sky, but neither John nor his wife could tell what he meant to do. They assumed he was drunk and trying to smoke a cigarette. Whatever the case, they paid him no more attention and continued their walk. About half an hour later, another couple passed the same spot and stopped for a moment to look at him. This time he seemed not to be moving. They weren't entirely sure. His left arm was stretched out over the sand, and mosquitoes and flies hovered around his face. The man in the couple joked that he would have to be dead not to notice the insect bites. The next morning, John returned to the beach for a swim and saw a crowd gathered around the man. This time it was clear. He hadn't been drunk or asleep. He had died before he could finish the last cigarette he had struggled to bring to his mouth. In his pockets, they found matches, a comb, an unused train ticket, a used bus ticket, cigarettes, a cigarette resting on his ear, a pack of chewing gum, but no identification. It seemed he had planned to take the train but was delayed and ended up taking the bus instead, which stopped a kilometer away. He wasn't wearing a hat, a detail that might not stand out today but was common at the time, especially with a suit. His shoes were shiny, freshly polished. And one more thing, every clothing label had been cut out. There were no visible injuries. His hands were clean, with no marks, in fact well cared for. That suggested he had no occupation involving manual labor, or if he once had, he hadn't done it for a long time. At the hospital, after a thorough examination, they found several organs filled with blood, showing clear signs of poisoning, yet he had not vomited even once, which was unusual if he had been lying on the beach for hours. Stranger still, if indeed he had all the signs of poisoning, the tests couldn't find any trace of poison in his body, no matter how many they performed. Another coroner, Thomas Cleland, continued to believe it was poison, but one of the type that leaves no trace because it breaks down quickly, such as strophanthine. Even if that was the case, they could never know how the poison had entered his body, whether he had taken it himself or someone else had administered it. What could be deduced was that he or someone else wanted to leave the fewest possible traces, choosing an invisible poison, not hard to obtain at least at the time, but one that hinted at a certain professionalism. Invisibility was, in fact, a recurring theme in this case. It was as if someone who had never existed had died in physical form. Physically, he had small peculiarities, just strange enough to stand out. His spleen was 3 times its normal size. His pupils, on the other hand, were unusually small. And finally, the toes on his feet tapered to a point, the kind of shape left after years of wearing narrow, pointed shoes. At first, the best they could do was keep the body in storage. From time to time, someone would come forward, believing they recognized him, usually a missing relative, but identification always ruled them out. This was the first dead end. They had no name and no poison. Motivated perhaps by the bus ticket and his suit, they thought he might have been traveling and thus might have left luggage somewhere. They searched within several kilometers, in hotels, bus stations, train stations, anywhere someone might have left personal belongings. That's when they found his suitcase. It was in the left luggage office at Adelaide Railway Station. It had been deposited there the same day he was seen on the beach, and no one had come back for it since. The station employees couldn't confirm whether the man on the beach was the same one who had left it, and as if the case were turning into some sort of unfunny joke, nothing inside the suitcase revealed who its owner was. There were a pair of slippers, a dressing gown, socks, underwear, pajamas, a screwdriver, a jacket manufactured in the United States. Remember, we are in Australia, and shaving equipment, among other items. Some pieces of clothing did have a name sewn into them, a tie labeled T. Keane and Keane stitched into a vest. Apparently, he had left those names in place because removing them would have damaged the garments. Even so, if he hadn't gotten rid of them, it was because he wasn't actually T. Keane. This detail about names and clothing needs explaining. It was 1948, a difficult year. World War II had ended, but the Cold War had begun a year earlier. Political tensions and economic instability had caused shortages in Australia and elsewhere. It was common practice to put one's name on clothing because garments, like food, were rationed. Each adult had 112 clothing coupons a year, 2 ration books, in fact. By the time they found the man on the beach, that law had been abolished for 6 months, but half a year was too short for full transition. Many still had their names sewn into clothing or had purchased second-hand garments with the previous owner's name still on them. That's why many people cut the labels, because that was where the name was usually sewn. And if they didn't, as in the case of the tie, it was because it had been stitched in such a way that removing it could damage the item. Returning to the suitcase, the T. Keane sewn into the tie, as promising as it might have seemed, led to the second dead end. No one with that name could be connected to the man. The jacket made in the United States raised another question. Had he come from there? Did he know someone who brought in clothes from the US? The questions multiplied, while answers were scarce. Months passed, and John Cleland requested a re-examination of all the evidence. That's when they found something incredible. In the man's pants, there was a very small, almost hidden inner pocket containing a scrap of paper with a phrase in Persian, "Tamam shud." The truth is, the first examination hadn't been very thorough, but assigning blame could wait. For now, they had a new lead. Reporter Frank Kennedy recognized the fragment and told police it came from a book of poetry called The Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. Finding a copy of the book was easy. The complicated, mysterious part was that they couldn't locate an edition that matched the fragment exactly. In this case, even the smallest clue had to be elusive and complicated. A tiny scrap of paper turned into a puzzle. While the search continued, the press offered interpretations of the fragment's literal meaning, ended, suggesting it might be the farewell of a man who no longer knew how to go on. A rushed goodbye. But as I said, speculation was the best anyone could do, and the few available clues led nowhere. After that, the body was finally buried. If you think everything up to this point was strange and couldn't get any stranger, wait and listen. 3 months after the note was found, a man nervously approached the police carrying a copy of the exact edition they had been looking for. That alone might have seemed like a miracle, but he also said the note they had found had been torn from this very book. He told them that 8 months earlier, around the time the man was found on the beach, he had discovered the book in the back seat of his car. Since he was with his brother-in-law at the time, he assumed it belonged to him, and the brother-in-law assumed it was his. They put it in the glove compartment, and there it stayed. He hadn't thought about it until he saw in the newspaper that the police were looking for that specific edition. Only then did they examine it closely and notice the missing page, making it clear it had not belonged to either of them. Apparently, someone had simply left the book in his car. Given the model of the vehicle, it wasn't suspicious that someone could have placed it there. The car was often left unlocked. And officially, the case wasn't being treated as a homicide. There was no reason to think the man was a suspect. It made no sense for someone to bring them a piece of evidence that could incriminate him if he were guilty. In any case, they examined the book carefully and found, written on the back, 2 phone numbers. One belonged to a bank. The other belonged to Nurse Jessica Thompson. When they contacted her and asked why her number was in that book, she told them that long ago, she had met a man she had fallen in love with and had given him that book. His name was Alfred Boxall. The brief excitement of thinking they had solved the case ended quickly when they learned it couldn't have been Alfred. Among other small details, he was still alive. He still had the copy she had given him, and his book had no missing pages. What were the odds that she had given the same edition of the book to 2 different people who weren't connected to each other? They returned to speak with Jessica, this time bringing the plaster cast of the man's face, and that's when the scene from the beginning took place. Despite her evident nervousness, the impression she might faint at any moment, and the way she quickly averted her eyes so she wouldn't have to look at him, she swore she didn't know who he was. She also admitted that about a year earlier, her neighbors had told her that a man had been looking for her, but they couldn't remember his face and he hadn't given his name. The book, one that spoke of living life to the fullest without regrets, still held another secret. A code that was only visible under ultraviolet light. It was a series of letters written in 4 lines, with the first 2 lines separated from the rest by 2 horizontal marks. The crossed-out section appeared to be a mistake, because if you looked closely, the 3rd line began the same way. ML. This code has passed through the hands of the greatest experts in cryptography and military intelligence, and they have never been able to decipher it. To this day, no one knows what it says, if it says anything at all, or if it's just a random sequence of letters. And so, in such an unusual way, they realized there was nothing more they could do. They didn't know who he was, how he died, why he was on the beach, what the code meant, or why the nurse had reacted the way she did. They didn't know if he had taken the poison himself or if someone had silenced him. Many questions, yes, but together they left very few real possibilities. First, we have to consider that, deep down, I think he did it himself. Think about it. He dies lying on the beach, near a woman who clearly seems to recognize him, with a note in his pocket reading, "Ended." It's a scene that feels almost too romantic. Why would someone else go to the trouble of taking him to the beach, slipping the note into a hidden inner pocket, and leaving a book with a phone number that led directly to a woman who appeared to know him? That would contradict the subtlety of using an untraceable poison while at the same time leaving an even bigger clue. So, let's suppose he did it himself. Why? And why use an invisible poison? The nurse once said she was very grateful to have met her husband. She said that because they had a child together, but the child was not his. She had conceived it with another man. It's more than believable that this other man was the Somerton man. That would explain her reaction and her refusal to acknowledge him. Perhaps she thought that if she admitted it, she would lose her husband. Who knows? Maybe she met him during the war, and they spent time together before separating. If the man her neighbors had seen was him, it might have been an attempt to see her again, or to see his child, and he could have become depressed when he discovered she was married. A year later, he tears out the page, dresses in a suit, shines his shoes, and takes poison on the beach. A realistic version. But why didn't he have any identification? And why use that type of poison? Those two details are what make the imagination run wild and give rise to the theory that he was a spy, someone for whom hiding his identity was vital. Dramatic as it may sound, it could make some sense, or even fit within the same framework. Let's keep assuming he met the nurse and had a child with her. If he was working undercover, being with her would have made him vulnerable. That book, so unique, so suspicious, despite all efforts, there was no other exactly like it, not to mention the code written inside. More than just a book, it seemed like a unique and indecipherable channel of communication. This romance theory is supported by the fact that when Jessica's son grew up, he appeared to have physical features similar to those of the Somerton man, especially his teeth and ears. These characteristics seem to strongly suggest he was his father. The truth may finally be known when Professor Derek Abbott completes DNA testing with Rachel Egan, who is the nurse's granddaughter, and, if the hypothesis is correct, the Somerton man's granddaughter as well. That would confirm the theory of an impossible romance, though we would still never know his real name. A man in love who, for some reason, could not see his son, whether because she rejected him or because he couldn't, would be the ideal solution, if not for one final detail. While reviewing the police statements archived in 1959, Private Detective Jerry Feltus found one that had been overlooked. On that day at Somerton Beach, a witness claimed to have seen a man carrying another person over his shoulder near the shoreline, in the very same spot where, the next day, the man who never existed would be found. All human societies, for as long as there's been recorded history, have had games. We don't limit ourselves to solving problems out of necessity. We do it for fun. Even in adulthood, leave a human alone with a knotted rope and they'll untie it. Leave a human alone with building blocks and they'll build something. Games are part of what makes us human. We see the world as a mystery, a puzzle, because our species has always enjoyed solving problems. And Cicada 3301 is now part of the internet. It's one of the countless stories of mystery and puzzles you can find here. But while it may blend into the mix, it's not quite like the others. It's much longer, more complex, and, best of all, more incomplete. Even after years of feeding the legend and creating puzzles that lead nowhere, it's still not known for sure who started it or who's behind Cicada 3301. First, we'll go over the story, summarized just enough to avoid dragging on. And at the end, I'll discuss all the details that don't make sense. To make it more comprehensible, we'll divide it according to their public appearances. The first contact was this image, an anonymous post on the forum where all disasters happen, the nest of all that's good and bad. Forchon. The anonymous message said, "Hello, we are looking for highly intelligent individuals. To find them, we have created a test. There is a hidden message in this image. Find it, and it will lead you on the road to finding us. We look forward to meeting the few who will make it all the way through. Good luck." Ich bin used most people, knowing the kind of things posted on 4chan, assumed that opening the image would trigger a screamer, a rickroll, or some other prank. To give you an idea, if you've never been there, let me tell you about some of the current threads, without images, because they're all the same. The first, trap thread, followed by a teacher from Texas naked, one asking people to post photos of women they know in real life. Naked. Hentai without clothes. Who's your girlfriend? Complete with well-written rules. Post the welcome sign for Pennsylvania, with all the comments being of girls in underwear. You get the picture. Even with that environment, there were still those who took the premise seriously and tried to find the message. No one succeeded. Until Joel Eriksson arrived. He was a computer security expert and mystery enthusiast. Although he was late to the game, as he put it, he was the first to uncover the hidden message. A coded message, in fact, where each letter had to be replaced with another, following a logical pattern he also figured out. The result was a web page showing the image of a duck. Was this a joke or just a false lead? While others kept searching for another possible hidden message in the original image, Joel noticed two words that could form the name of a decryption software. Outguess, well known in those circles. So it was easy for him. He used it, extracted another address, and it led him to a subreddit where he found this code, leading to yet more puzzles. At this point, he knew this would be a long haul, bouncing from one place to another, but it was exciting, so he pressed on. The Reddit page contained a hidden book, of course, and a code to use later. To decode the book, you first had to find the key, which was there but split into two parts. One in the page name and the other in the symbols above, which were actually numbers. Seeing them side by side gave you the hint that they were the same thing. If they matched, then the letters had the values indicated. A would be 10, B 14, and so on. With that, you could work out the rest of the numbers in the fragment. You knew you were on the right track because in reverse it wouldn't work. There was no way to turn 2 into a letter, for example, because no value had been assigned to it, and so, at last, you had the key. It told you how far to shift in the alphabet to find the correct letter. Using it as a template, you'd see, for example, that you had the letter V, and your key told you to move 10 spaces. Forward made no sense, but moving backward gave you the first clear word, king. The rest could be done manually, which would be unnecessarily long, or you could create a macro, or even Excel could probably handle it to speed things up. Now, with the decoded book, it was time to use the other key, which was much simpler. The first digit was the line, the second, the letter. The final phrase that emerged was, "Call us at this number." But Joel didn't stop there. Investigating the original image as they had instructed, he quickly saw that the image's dimensions, the height and width, produced two more numbers, 509 and 503. Following what those numbers indicated took him to a web page that no longer exists, but at the time displayed a countdown timer with the image of a cicada. Days passed, and when the timer hit 0, it revealed coordinates, locations where you could find clues in the form of QR codes placed all around the world. In total, there were 14, but they contained only 2 unique messages repeated, so it wasn't necessary to find them all. And then the cycle began again. Codes leading to books, poems in this case, which pointed to a page on the deep web. Joel says that here there was a time limit, and since he arrived late, he couldn't get in. The page had already disappeared, but he heard that those who made it in time were told they would be contacted soon. More hidden messages followed, along with songs, doors, and more twists, until Cicada posted a public message saying they were disappointed that people had formed groups and shared information because they only wanted the best, not their followers. Ironically, the ones who arrived were exactly those followers, the people who had been tracking the entire plot and were quickest to reach that page. In any case, they received private messages saying contact had been made, and a month later, on the same Reddit page, they announced that it was over and that there would be more opportunities in the future. By this point, Cicada was already famous. To prevent anyone from hijacking the concept, they created a signature embedded in each image to verify authenticity. Then came a long silence. The second contact came a year later. They posted another image on 4chan. It looked similar, but the clues led to different places. Still, the same technique was used, a code extracted with outguess, leading to a riddle to find a book, a key to use on the book, which led to a new address, clues in an automated Twitter account, keys you couldn't yet use. It ended much the same as before. The first to reach the end got a message saying they'd be contacted. The difference this time was that no public announcement was made to mark the end. Still, people assumed it was over when, once again, after a year of strict silence, they returned. The third contact saw them getting a little more electronic art with it. The encryption method was the same: images to use without guess, books, keys, and a web address. But here came the first puzzle that still hasn't been completely solved. A book written by Cicada using runes they had revealed a year earlier, but only partially. More than half the book remains there, visible to all but unreadable. What has been decoded hasn't been very satisfying, and one page pointed to a site with a song. Another pointed to a deep web page that no longer exists. You can imagine paths leading nowhere. People expected them to return in 2015, but they didn't. Until 2016, when they came back only to remind everyone that the book still needed to be solved. And it still hasn't been. But before you jump into Sherlock Holmes mode, you need to know one thing. All those people who reached the end, with the promise that they would be contacted, never were. They simply disappeared. So, by process of elimination, what do we have? Activists, encryption fanatics with a legal but secret objective? A group of friends who meet in the afternoons to eat sunflower seeds until their tongues go numb? An organization that doesn't participate in anything illegal, at least according to them when accused, and apparently doesn't want to make money from it either. And apparently they don't seek fame, because after so many years, the story has grown so much that if they revealed themselves publicly, they'd get plenty of attention from newspapers, television, and radio. It's true that unwrapping the gift is often more gratifying than the gift itself, but I don't think they'd have any trouble landing important positions if they wanted to. It really does seem that money isn't what drives them, or maybe there isn't as much genius behind this as we've attributed. When something doesn't make sense, it often helps to see it more simply. And what I see is this. If you review all their references, it's chaotic, with no real connection. They used ancient and modern writers, poems, paintings, composers like Bach, Zen philosophy, and even sprinkled in some esotericism. It feels like someone trying too hard to appear interesting. If you look at the methods they use to encrypt messages, you see the same thing. A compilation of practically every encryption method in existence, always repeating the same pattern. Here's the thing. When you're looking for intelligent people, like in intelligence tests, what's asked is that through logic, they solve a situation. So, if you put 23 16 inches in a sequence, you expect them to deduce that the question mark is 10, because adding the previous numbers would give you 16. You should be able to figure that out without much prior knowledge. In this case, just knowing how to count. In practice, this is much more complex. The most popular system for professionally measuring intelligence is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS-4, which measures verbal comprehension IQ, classifying words, antonyms, synonyms, chains, relationships, meanings, mixing reasoning and memory. Then there's the performance IQ, pure reasoning, recognizing and following patterns, the typical shapes and figures you see in online tests, where speed also matters. It's not like the 5-minute online tests. This is a marathon. By the way, off topic but worth mentioning, within the most popular organizations for people with high IQs like Mensa or the 999 Society, there's a certain hypocrisy. Many people who get in haven't completed the full battery of psychometric tests. They do only part of it, and if they perform well enough, they're admitted. There are persistent rumors, coming from inside, not just outside, that they sometimes let in celebrities or attractive women to give the organization publicity and appeal. You can understand doing it for celebrities, but why the others? Well, considering that members pay dues, those who have gotten in this way, though not all, but certainly not a small number, aren't actually geniuses, nor do they have the scores they believe they have. At most, they're a group of talented people at taking a certain type of subtest. And here's a little trick. You can take advantage of a loophole and put all the intelligence points you want into your character, because you can buy the tests and memorize them. On this very convenient website for the modest price of $1,822.80. You can get the kit, complete with the answers and the manuals, so you know exactly what the psychologist will be looking for. I assure you, before you take the WAIS-4, you make a couple of intentional mistakes so it doesn't look suspicious. And there you go. Enjoy your new status, officially validated by a professional. No one will be able to tell you you're not a genius. Sounds like I'm selling you a plasmid in Rapture, doesn't it? And these people are so nice they'll even notify you when a new version is available. Anyway, back to the point. We've seen how logical intelligence works, but what happens when you use existing encryption as a method for finding intelligent people? That's a different game. It's more a matter of memory than intelligence. And those two things aren't necessarily linked. It's true that culture helps develop intelligence, the more vocabulary you have. For example, the easier it is, but that doesn't change the fact that a cultured person can make illogical connections, and that's what Cicada was asking for. They rewarded those with greater memory and education, those who could quickly identify which encryption method had been used. Once you know that, it's like assembling a puzzle with numbered pieces. It takes time, but it's not difficult. I'm not saying it's not impressive. It's a massive challenge, but if the goal is to find intelligent people, it's not the best way to do it. What you get is experts or enthusiasts in encryption who are drawn to a mysterious challenge. Whether they're intelligent or not, you can't know for sure, even if they make it to the end. So that very first line they used to introduce themselves was a lie. They weren't looking for intellectuals. They were looking for code breakers. They presented them with a dark, intricate scavenger hunt, knowing they'd be eager to solve it, even if, in the end, they just vanished. I'd been wondering why they placed messages and clues in the physical world for a group that operates entirely online and focuses on digital encryption. Why would they want them to go out into the street? But then I understood. It was about escalation. They don't force you directly, but if you want to continue playing, you have to go out and find a clue someone left. By doing so, you've indirectly accepted an order, and even if it's a trivial one, you're more likely to accept future orders. Little by little, you invest more time and effort, and what they want is loyalty. When you reach the end, they can't be sure you'll stay, but this increases the chances. Another detail, the majority of the real-world locations were in the United States. That's because proximity mattered. They expected in some way to meet in person. More clues in your territory mean the winners are in your territory, which makes perfect sense if Cicada is something like a company looking to hire code breakers. These real-world clues would be designed so that the potential recruit is close by. It makes sense, but why all the secrecy if it's clear they're not a secret organization like the CIA? Why so much effort to hide? We can rule out the CIA or any other major agency. It's not random, though. It's carefully designed. But the CIA wouldn't post a message on 4chan because it would attract far too many undesirables. They wouldn't claim to be looking for intellectuals using a system that can't guarantee that, nor would they claim to want only the best while using a method that can't ensure it, especially when it's so convoluted that no one could know all the references alone, except Joel Eriksson. If people helped each other, whoever reached the end wouldn't have done it alone. An actual organization would be careful with such details, and there's no benefit in dragging a recruitment process on for years. Historically, the closest thing to Cicada was the puzzle released by GCHQ, the British Intelligence Service, on their website. The rest of the comparisons people make are to viral marketing campaigns that, although they started mysteriously, eventually revealed the product, a game, a movie, a series. Google did something similar to both advertise and recruit. There was even one created by students that spiraled far beyond their control. But all these are different because, in a short time, it became clear they were marketing campaigns. As I said, GCHQ's puzzle seems the most similar, but not by much. The first difference is that we knew who they were from the start, because it was on their official site, and the rewarders are clear from day one, a prize or a possible job. This meant mystery enthusiasts didn't get involved. What they did was post a simple beginner-level puzzle, a tutorial essentially, and ask if you could solve it. You had 2 months, and those who solved it would get an interview and maybe a job with British intelligence. Simple, direct, with a time limit, and knowing the reward from the start. A single puzzle so hard that solving it earned you an interview for a job paying between £20,000 and £50,000 a month. See the difference? That's a far cry from hiding a code in an image that leads to a book, which leads to an image that tries to trick you into thinking you're wrong, only to reveal that it's the clue itself. It ends up looking more like a childish game drawing esoteric symbols and mixing a million random things to seem more mysterious. And that's the point. The mistake is trying to give meaning to a puzzle whose references mean nothing. So, once we rule out the CIA and viral marketing, we're left with 3 realistic possibilities. First, Cicada is anonymous or a branch with slightly different goals but built in the same way. I'm not convinced, but it's possible. They could be testing future members. A small piece of evidence, though maybe just coincidence, is that some of the QR code clues left in the real world were in countries of known cybersecurity experts and hackers who had once been part of Anonymous. Second, Cicada is a game similar to the cybersecurity competitions held worldwide, a kind of capture the flag for hackers. These events come in different forms, but they usually involve teams, and the first to finish wins. It's not only fun, but offers prizes, sometimes as much as $15,000, and serves as strong credentials. Many competitors are legends in the field. You can find people like Cal Leeming, who created a company, designed new data processing tools, and years later sold it and its patents to Google, becoming very wealthy but staying at Google because he loves what he does. Or George Hotz, the guy who hacked the PlayStation 3 and the iPhone. And if you let him near you, he might just hack your soul. He built his own self-driving car in his garage and is now working on something to compete with Tesla. The challenges in these competitions aren't as visually mysterious as Cicada's. They're more technical, but in essence, it's not that different. Cicada could be this, just dressed up in a dark, beautiful aesthetic. The creators of such competitions wouldn't have much reason to create Cicada, but a group of friends who participate might. Recruiting people for future competitions would increase their chances of winning, and while the prizes aren't millions, $15,000 is nothing to sneeze at. The only thing that doesn't make sense in this theory is why Cicada would get angry when people worked in groups, since these competitions are team-based, and worse, why they would always disappear afterward. Which brings me to the third possibility. Cicada 3301 was Joel Eriksson. The more I learned about the story, the more I saw that many, if not all, mentioned Joel as the only one capable of solving it, the one they named in connection with the most complex and elaborate mystery on the internet. Only one person made it to the end entirely on their own. Those who got close did so thanks to him. Curious, isn't it? When British intelligence did their puzzle, about 150 people solved it, and that was for entry into the service that protects an entire country. Who could create a mystery so complex that only one person could solve it? The same person who already had the answers. Joel Eriksson, the man who solved everything but, in the end, coincidentally, wasn't among the winners, even though Cicada messaged him saying they were proud of him, that he was the only one to do it all alone, yet he was left out. In other words, he staged an exhibition, a magic trick, letting a few others slip through, then playing dumb and letting the story spread, along with his name. Joel is no ordinary guy. He's recognized and endorsed by the deputy director of the NSA for his cybersecurity knowledge. He'd know how to create the illusion that a large organization was behind it. He's a fan of these competitions, and with his team, he created one of them, the Midnight Sun CTF. He's not shy about traveling anywhere. Moscow, China, Japan, North Korea. He knows plenty of people who could do him the small favor of pasting a piece of paper somewhere, or he could have done it himself during his travels. But why go to all that effort for publicity? Because his name appears in every article, in every retelling, as the one man who alone reached the end of what's called the most complex puzzle on the internet. That's a lot of recognition, and there's more. Maybe I'm overanalyzing, but a year after Cicada appeared, a company was founded in Canada called Cicada Figura, which provides cybersecurity consulting. The similarity in the name is a big coincidence, and the fact that Joel started working there a year after the first appearance? Suspicious. I think I'll leave it here. Hopefully I'm wrong, and all this began so that, after years and years of mystery, it would end with nothing more than an image, and nothing else. Imagine you're at home watching television on an ordinary night, and suddenly a man appears on screen with a revolver in his hand. He points it at his own head and pulls the trigger. This isn't a movie or a series. It was broadcast live in front of millions of viewers. It was a dangerous stunt designed by one of the most brilliant and controversial mentalists in the United Kingdom. Today, I'm going to tell you how Derren Brown played Russian roulette in real life. Derren Brown is not a common illusionist. Despite having played with cards and rabbits, he is above all a psychological mentalist. To create his shows, he combines knowledge of hypnosis, psychology, body language, suggestion, and social manipulation. Among his most famous tricks is the time he convinced a group of strangers to rob a bank. These were ordinary people who, through psychological conditioning, were driven to the point of being willing to commit an armed robbery without receiving anything in return. Or the time he made a man believe for weeks that he had survived the apocalypse. It was all an elaborate setup with actors, abandoned hospitals, and even fake government broadcasts. And if he was able to do that with strangers, what would happen if this time the person at risk was himself? On October 5, 2003, Derren performed one of the boldest feats anyone could attempt on live television. For this occasion, he launched an online call to recruit volunteers for the next episode of his program, in which they would play Russian roulette. 12,000 people applied to the form, of which only 100 were meticulously chosen by Derren and his team to undergo a series of tests. Almost the entire 50-minute episode consists of filtering and eliminating the participants he considered less competent for the final test. The last individual left standing had the obligation to load the revolver with a single bullet and sit to witness firsthand what could potentially turn into a real death on live television. When the number of candidates was reduced to only 5, they were taken to a rural area, an isolated barn on the island of Jersey, near the border with France. The program had to finish filming there because British firearm laws are extremely strict. In England, possessing, carrying, or using real weapons without specific licenses is prohibited, and simulating Russian roulette with a real gun would have been completely illegal on British soil. The 5 participants lived there for several days, underwent another round of aptitude tests, and were under constant 24-hour observation until the winner was finally chosen. The chosen one was James. He wasn't an actor or a stooge. He was simply someone Derren Brown, for some reason, considered ideal. James's role was no small matter. He had to place a single bullet into one of the 6 chambers of the revolver, spin the cylinder, and hand it over. A decision carrying enormous moral and psychological weight. He, in front of the cameras, would be the only direct witness of the act, no matter what happened. They gathered at a table inside a set built in the barn. To add credibility, a collaborator brought the ammunition and tested the revolver by firing into a sandbag. Derren then asked everyone to leave the room for safety reasons, except James, who proceeded to load the single bullet into the cylinder marked with numbers from 1 to 6, written by hand. Then James sat behind a bulletproof glass panel to protect him in case of an accident, and finally, he was asked to count out loud from 1 to 6. Derren began with number 3 and followed the sequence. The gun clicked, empty. He continued, another empty chamber. Now only 3 attempts remained, and one of them held the bullet. He knew there was a 33% chance that this would go terribly wrong. He took his time, until once again, Derren emerged unscathed from a test that kept more than 3.3 million viewers tense in their homes, convinced they were about to see a man die on live television. And as always, with something so disruptive, criticism came quickly. Thousands of users flooded the internet the next day with theories and hypotheses trying to uncover the truth behind the act. The most widespread theory was that the ammunition was blank, like those used in film productions. Even the Jersey police had to step in and support this explanation to calm the wave of furious people who were outraged that authorities had allowed such an irresponsible stunt. But it's curious, because blanks at such short distances can still be harmful. Actors have died from close-range blank fire. Brandon Lee died on set when a poorly handled blank round struck him in the chest during a scene. Or even worse, the case of actor Jon-Erik Hexum, who while joking behind the scenes, unaware of the real danger, pressed a blank-loaded gun to his temple and pulled the trigger. Though it contained no projectiles, the explosion at such close range fractured his skull and caused a fatal brain hemorrhage. Both cases were ruled accidents, but they show that even a fake bullet can be deadly under certain circumstances. Whatever the case with Derren Brown, there are hundreds of other theories and suspicions, but one must not forget that he is a showman, and he achieved his goal of keeping millions on the edge of their seats for several minutes, convinced they were about to witness a real death on television. And his art is not risk, it is control. Absolute control of the mind, even yours. Perhaps you're wondering why, 20 years later, something that generated such high ratings has never been repeated on television. And the answer is simple, because it can't be. After the broadcast, the program received more than 160 formal complaints. Some countries, like Germany, censored or outright banned its airing. Many accused the channel of going too far. And we're talking about Channel 4, one of the most provocative broadcasters in all of England. In the past, they had aired a real autopsy on another program, and even broadcast a documentary with an extremely graphic abortion. But with Derren Brown, they felt they had crossed a dangerous line, because it's one thing to show something explicitly, and quite another to toy with the possibility of someone dying live. Since then, the channel has toned down, and so has the industry in general. And that's what makes this trick so special. It is unique and unrepeatable. And if you thought what Derren Brown did on live television was shocking, the next story takes fear to an entirely different level. In 2002, two snipers turned Washington, D.C. into a war zone. Hidden in the trunk of a car, they shot 17 people at random, paralyzing the nation with fear for 23 days. Schools went into lockdown, parents ducked while pumping gas, and no one felt safe. This full-length documentary tells the true story of the DC sniper attacks, how John Allen Mohammed and Lee Boyd Malvos carried out their deadly mission, how the FBI and local police raced to stop them, and how one single fingerprint brought it all to an end.